In every kingdom, behind every throne, there's a rumour whispered too quietly for the history books. But some queens didn't just rule. They rewrote the rules of power, pleasure and politics. From scandal-drenched courts to whispered bedroom alliances, these 25 royal women seduced entire empires and terrified them. Were they lovers, manipulators, or just women with too much agency for their time? You decide, because once the crown goes on, nothing stays sacred. Welcome to 25 Queens Who Slept With Everyone, where history isn't just written by the victors, it's moaned through palace walls. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next descent into history's shadowy back rooms. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila? 3 a.m. in New York? We want to know who's wide awake with us, wandering through royal scandals the textbooks tried to forget. 1. Catherine the Great, Russia. By the time she became the Great, Catherine was already the empress of rumours. They followed her like powdered perfume, lingering long after the last flick of her fan. Whispers curled around the corners of court corridors, attaching themselves to candlelight and keyholes. Some were scandalous, some were absurd, some were maddeningly both. But one thing was certain: Catherine of Russia didn't just inherit an empire, she seduced it into modernity. And in doing so, she earned a reputation that no amount of enlightenment could sanitize. Let's be clear about something from the start. Catherine the Great didn't die having sex with a horse. That's propaganda. French propaganda, to be specific, whispered by men who never forgave her for being a woman with ambition and an army. The story was anatomically implausible and logistically laughable, but it stuck because it felt like a punchline history wanted to believe. After all, who else but a woman in power would be accused of something so grotesque, not because she did it, but because she dared to do everything else? Born a minor German princess, Catherine married into Russian royalty like one might plunge into icy water, fast, committed, and immediately regretting it. Her husband, Peter III, was, how shall we say, a man whose emotional intelligence hovered somewhere between a spoiled cabbage and a broken music box. He played with toy soldiers in bed. He idolized Frederick the Great to the point of cosplay. He may have been functionally sterile. He was, by every account, profoundly unfit to rule, and even more unfit to be her partner. So she found others. The list of Catherine's lovers reads less like a scandal sheet and more like a resume for 18th century emotional support. Officers, diplomats, poets, all chosen not just for their bodies, but their usefulness. There was Sergei Saltykov, the supposed father of her first child, Grigory Orlov, who helped her overthrow her husband, Grigory Potemkin, the man who possibly married her in secret, and definitely organized her lovers after him like a military campaign. Catherine didn't just take lovers, she gave them pensions, promotions, and country estates. She curated them like paintings, then moved on when the composition no longer suited the frame, and for each affair, Russia flourished. This is the inconvenient truth that made her enemies so creative with their slander. Catherine ruled. She expanded the empire by 200,000 square miles, modernized its administration, patronized the arts, corresponded with Voltaire, and flirted with the idea of ending serfdom before realizing that serfs were more politically useful when left suffering. She was enlightened, sure, but not naive. She played philosopher queen in the salons, but in the back rooms she was pure strategist. Still, the court gossips obsessed over her libertinage, a word they used to mean woman who controls who she sleeps with. Her bed became a proxy battlefield for power, and the more she ruled like a man, the more rumors tried to feminize her downfall. They said she had erotic furniture, chairs carved into obscene shapes, rooms decorated for decadent rituals. They said she maintained a secret passage from her bedroom to her lover's chambers. They said her lovers were replaced as quickly as she replaced ministers, which, to be fair, might have been true in both cases. But maybe the most unsettling thing about Catherine's story isn't the sex, it's the competence. She ruled for 34 years, longer than any female leader in Russian history. She was intelligent, practical, emotionally brutal when necessary, and privately sentimental when no one was watching. She could pen treaties and theatre reviews with equal elegance, and she knew, perhaps better than any of her Enlightenment pen pals, that power was never clean and always personal. Yet her legacy, for centuries, was reduced to innuendo and myth. That's how history disciplines women who do too much. It rewrites them as jokes. But the empire she left behind wasn't laughing. It was larger, richer, and paradoxically more fragile, because it had been propped up for decades by the singular will of one woman. A woman who knew that seduction was not a sin when survival depended on it. A woman whose greatest lover may have been Russia itself. And speaking of women rewritten by scandal, the next one didn't just have lovers. She had one so powerful, people whispered that he ruled the kingdom in her name. His name wasn't her husband, it was her alleged soulmate, and some say her children's true father. 2. Marie Louise of Parma, Queen of Spain. If Catherine the Great seduced an empire, Marie Louise of Parma was accused of being seduced by everyone but it. She was not Russian, nor particularly great. She was not brilliant in letters or beloved by Enlightenment philosophers. But in the swirling vortex of Bourbon Spain, where court life was equal parts opera and inquisition, she became the leading lady of a quiet scandal that shaped a crumbling empire. And she did it with pearls, powdered hair, and a man named Manuel de Godoy always 2 steps behind her, and sometimes not behind her at all. Marie Louise's story is, in essence, the story of a woman trapped in the decaying architecture of monarchy, trying, failing, and then apparently deciding to make the best of it by scandalizing half of Europe. She married Charles IV of Spain, a man so unremarkable that historians frequently forget to describe him at all. If they do, it's to note that he liked clocks, dogs, and hunting, not necessarily in that order. He was a monarch with the energy of a taxidermy exhibit, quiet, gentle, and deeply uninterested in ruling. Unfortunately for Spain, it needed a ruler, and unfortunately for Marie Louise, it needed one too. So in walked Manuel de Godoy. Godoy was not royal. He was a soldier, then a courtier, then somehow the prince of the peace. He rose to power through the kind of mysterious momentum that makes historians sweat. No official record of brilliance, no obvious qualifications, just a glimmer of charm and a royal wink that turned into political fire. And at the center of his miraculous ascent stood Marie Louise, smiling, scandalized, and possibly orchestrating the entire thing. The court called him her lover. The church called her a disgrace. The gossips whispered that many of her children bore Godoy's profile, not her husband's. Paintings were studied like paternity tests. One ambassador wrote that she ruled Spain through her bedroom, while another claimed she ran the court like a brothel dressed in lace. But like all royal scandals, the truth is buried under a velvet avalanche of propaganda and projection. What we do know is that Godoy was elevated faster than anyone in Spanish history, and Marie Louise was his most ardent defender. She insisted on his promotion, protected him from enemies, and travelled with him in ways that made privacy more of a suggestion than a practice. Whether or not she loved him, or simply used him as a political prosthetic, is the kind of question history loves to ask but can never answer. What we also know is that Spain, under their combined influence, fumbled its way into disaster. It was Godoy, backed by the Queen, who steered Spain into ill-fated alliances with France, first against the British, then against Napoleon, and then against logic itself. In trying to preserve Bourbon dignity, they essentially handed Spain over to foreign invasion. And as the empire fell apart, so did the monarchy. The people blamed Marie Louise, not for the wars necessarily, but for the man who seemed to cause them. By the early 1800s, the country was boiling. The Spanish people despised her. Caricatures depicted her as grotesque, oversexed, a monstrous queen with Godoy dangling from her skirts. Pamphlets called her a foreign whore. Riots demanded her removal. And in 1808, they got their wish. Charles IV was forced to abdicate, and Marie Louise, along with her king and her so-called lover, was exiled like a trio of operatic villains written out of the final act. They lived out their days in obscurity, bouncing between European courts, whispering about restoration and reminiscing about the smell of Spanish cedar in royal chambers. Godoy never regained power. Marie Louise never regained reputation. She died in Rome, far from the palace she once commanded, remembered not for policy or elegance or diplomacy, but for who she may or may not have taken to bed. Which brings us to the heart of the mystery. Was Marie Louise a power-hungry manipulator who ruled through scandal? Or was she just the nearest woman when the monarchy collapsed, forced to absorb the blame because no one wanted to blame the king? The truth probably is somewhere in between. A woman who made bad choices in a worse system, punished more for how she was rumoured to love than for how she ruled. But if you think Marie Louise's fate was cruel, spare a thought for the next queen, a woman whose power was so threatening that her entire downfall was choreographed like a courtroom drama. She didn't just die, she was executed for crimes that may never have happened and for lovers who may never have existed. 2 queens in, and already the royal sheets are getting harder to untangle. If you're still with us, you clearly like your history with a little intrigue, so make sure to subscribe for more stories they definitely didn't teach in school. And hey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it on your end? Late night doom scrolling in Dublin? Sunrise in Sao Paulo? We're building a global court of the curious, and you've just been knighted. 3. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England. By the time the axe fell, the truth had already lost its head. Anne Boleyn was never meant to be queen. She was meant to be a whisper, a mistress, a court flirt with clever eyes and a French education. Someone to be admired, maybe envied, but ultimately ignored by history. Instead, she became a revolution in a dress. The second wife of Henry VIII, the mother of Elizabeth I, and, most fatefully, the woman whose love life was rewritten as a list of sins to justify her destruction. They called her a seductress, a witch, a 6-fingered temptress with poison in her veins and ambition in her smile. She was the other woman before the phrase existed, but long before she lost her crown and then her life, Anne Boleyn was a lesson in how dangerous it is to want something more than survival. Let's rewind. Anne entered the English court not as a temptress, but as a polished, well-educated noblewoman returning from years in the French court. She spoke fluent flirtation, yes, but also Latin, theology, and fashion diplomacy. She knew how to charm, how to provoke, and most importantly, how to withhold. And it was that last skill that made her unforgettable to one particular man, King Henry VIII. Henry was already married when he met Anne. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, was noble, dignified, and in his eyes increasingly inconvenient. She had failed to give him a male heir. She had grown politically distant. And worst of all, she refused to disappear. So when Henry began to notice Anne, not just for her looks, but for her refusal to sleep with him, he decided, with all the subtlety of a canon, that she should be his queen. This is where things stopped being romantic and started being political theology. Henry sought an annulment. The Pope refused. Henry broke with the Catholic Church, declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and effectively rewrote divine authority just so he could marry Anne. That's how powerful she was. Or rather, that's how powerful he wanted her to be. And for a brief moment, Anne Boleyn had everything. She became queen. She wore it like armor. She gave birth to a daughter, not the son Henry wanted, but a future monarch nonetheless. She engaged in debates, influenced court appointments, funded humanist causes. She was clever, opinionated, and far more politically involved than a Tudor queen was supposed to be. And that, predictably, began to wear thin. Henry's love cooled, the court turned, Anne became inconvenient, a reminder of broken promises and missing heirs. And in Henry's world, inconvenience was treason. So the rumours began. They said she had lovers. Not one, not two, but 5, including her own brother. The charges were explosive: adultery, incest, conspiracy to kill the king. No evidence was necessary, only signatures. The accused men were arrested, tortured, executed. Anne was brought to trial in a performance of legal theatre so flimsy it barely pretended to be real. She defended herself with wit and grace, which only made things worse. A woman who didn't cry? Dangerous. A woman who answered calmly? Guilty. She was sentenced to death. On the day of her execution, she wore a red petticoat and a grey gown, Tudor for "look me in the eye." She gave a short speech praising the king, asking for prayers and maintaining her dignity. She was beheaded by a French swordsman, specially imported for the occasion, an ironic courtesy given the nature of the charges. And just like that, the queen was gone. But her story was not. Anne Boleyn has been remembered in fragments as a martyr, a villain, a feminist icon, a pawn. Her sexual reputation became the hinge on which her entire life story swung. Did she really have those affairs? Probably not. The evidence was laughably flimsy, even by 16th century standards. But she was a woman in power. She was no longer useful, and the best way to erase a powerful woman in a patriarchal court was to rewrite her as a cautionary tale. But here's the real twist. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would grow up to become one of the most formidable monarchs in European history. A woman who ruled alone, who never married, who turned every rumour into a myth of invincibility. Which makes you wonder, maybe Anne didn't die in vain. Maybe the daughter inherited more than the crown. Maybe she inherited the grit to wear it differently. And if Anne Boleyn's fall was a warning shot in the Tudor bloodbath, the next queen didn't dodge it. She followed in Anne's footsteps, literally, in marriage, in scandal, and in the silent walk to the scaffold. But unlike Anne, this queen never stood a chance. She was young, naive, and already broken before the accusations ever arrived. 4. Catherine Howard, Queen of England. Catherine Howard was about 15 years old when the chessboard was already set, and she didn't even know she was a pawn. By the time she became queen, she was surrounded by masks, courtiers with smiles like knives, an aging king desperate to recapture youth, and a family that treated her like a decorative offering to the altar of royal ambition. She had charm, yes, she had beauty, but in the Tudor court, those were often fatal attributes. And Catherine had something else too, a past, or, more accurately, a collection of whispered rumours and adolescent entanglements that would later be weaponized into a noose disguised as justice. To understand Catherine's fall, you have to first understand the man she married. Henry VIII was on wife number 5. By the time he chose Catherine Howard, he was physically decaying, emotionally volatile, and politically insecure. The king, who once jousted for sport, now hobbled on an ulcerated leg, cloaking bitterness in velvet. He needed a distraction, he needed affirmation, and he needed someone young enough to forget that his court had become a cemetery for queens. Catherine was a teenager. Henry was 49. She wasn't selected because she was wise. She was selected because she was radiant. And more importantly, she was a Howard, niece to the Duke of Norfolk, whose family had already failed once with Anne Boleyn. This time, they'd try again, only softer, sweeter, more obedient. Catherine was packaged as the antidote to scandal, the fresh, innocent face who would redeem the king's troubled reign. No one seemed to care that she didn't even understand the rules of the game, but court life has a way of peeling back illusions. And Catherine, naive though she was, didn't remain a secret for long. You see, before she became queen, Catherine lived in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, a place less like a finishing school and more like a gilded holding pen for politically adjacent girls. There she had flirtations, exchanges, maybe more. One of them was with her music tutor, Henry Manox, a man who later claimed things that would re-emerge with eerie precision when it suited others to repeat them. Then came Francis Derham, a bolder suitor. He allegedly called her his wife and acted the part in front of other servants. These weren't scandals then, they were adolescent dramas. But in the Tudor court, the past has a way of returning with a dagger tucked into its sleeve. Still, the real problem wasn't what Catherine did before she married the king. It was what she allegedly did after. Enter Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's chamber. Young, ambitious, possibly charming, possibly dangerous. What we know is that he and Catherine met, secretly, repeatedly, sometimes aided by one of her ladies-in-waiting. What we don't know is what happened behind those locked doors. There were letters, there were servants who talked, there were suspicions, but no clear evidence. Not that it mattered. Once whispers reached Archbishop Cranmer, and once Cranmer reached Henry, the machinery of royal panic turned with brutal speed. Henry, who once called Catherine his rose without a thorn, reportedly broke down upon hearing the accusations. Betrayal, in his eyes, wasn't just personal, it was treason. Catherine was interrogated, pressured, her past laid out like a tapestry of seduction and deceit. The men involved were arrested, tortured, confessions were extracted. How willingly, history doesn't care to specify. What it does record is this: once the narrative was set, there was no turning back. Catherine was stripped of her title, imprisoned, condemned. She was accused not only of adultery, but of concealing her prior relationships from the king, a sin of omission that, in Tudor logic, could equal treason. She was sentenced to die. But before she went to the scaffold, she asked for the execution block to be brought to her cell, not out of morbid curiosity, but so she could rehearse, practice kneeling, practice grace, practice silence. It's one of the few things that makes her seem real in the chaos of royal myth. A teenage girl rehearsing how to die with dignity in a world that had never allowed her to live freely. On the day of her execution, she was calm. She said little. She knelt, and with that the rose without a thorn was erased. Not because she was dangerous, but because she was inconvenient. Her fall wasn't just about alleged infidelity. It was about a king's pride, a court's paranoia, and a world where a woman's worth was measured in purity, obedience, and political silence. But Catherine's legacy didn't disappear entirely. In modern eyes, she's been reimagined not as a villain, but as a victim of grooming, of politics, of history's sharpest scissors. And still, her story is often reduced to the same familiar formula. Young, beautiful, reckless, dead. Yet the next queen in our list flipped the formula entirely. She didn't go quietly, she didn't beg, and she didn't play innocent. Instead, she ruled with one eye on the throne and the other on her enemies, and some say on the sharp end of a blade meant for her own son. 5. Irene of Athens, Byzantine Empress. If the Byzantine Empire had a taste for irony, and it very much did, then Irene of Athens was its finest vintage. She was a woman who rose to supreme power in an empire ruled by men, only to be remembered as the woman who may have destroyed her own son to keep it. Whether she actually did is, as always, lost in the fog of ancient accusations. But one thing is undeniable. Irene was not just a scandal. She was a political thunderstorm wrapped in silk and suspicion. She entered the imperial court not as a firebrand, but as a bride, a beautiful aristocratic girl from Athens, chosen by Emperor Constantine V to marry his son Leo IV. She was picked for her looks perhaps, and for her connections, but certainly not for her future ambitions. No one expected the girl from Athens to rewire the machinery of empire, and yet that's exactly what she did. Leo IV, her husband, became emperor in 775. Their marriage was as cold as the Byzantine winters and just as bleak. He tolerated her presence, ignored her influence and, critically, opposed her religious beliefs. Irene was a staunch supporter of icons. Leo was a staunch iconoclast. To the modern ear, it might sound like a niche theological disagreement. To Byzantium, it was civil war in miniature. Icons weren't just paintings, they were flashpoints of divine authority. To support them was to declare one's allegiance to the old faith. To destroy them was to declare war on tradition. And Irene, even before she was empress in name, knew which side she wanted to win. Leo died suddenly, perhaps of illness, perhaps of stress, or, depending on your sources, perhaps of Irene being very persuasive with his doctors. Regardless, his death left the throne to their son, Constantine VI. But Constantine was only 9 years old. So Irene did what ambitious mothers in autocratic systems have always done. She became regent. At first, it looked like standard imperial procedure, a mother protecting her son's rule. But slowly, subtly, she began to shift the balance. She signed documents in her name. She placed loyalists in key positions. She reinstated the veneration of icons. A deeply symbolic move that enraged half the court and elevated her status among the devout. By the time Constantine came of age, the empire no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her. What followed was a Byzantine soap opera of failed coups, maternal manipulation, and power games that would make any modern political strategist blush. Constantine tried to assert himself. He pushed back against his mother's authority. He exiled her allies. He tried to rule. And for his troubles, he got exactly what every son of a reigning empress should fear: public humiliation, mass desertion by his troops, and finally, an arrest. Then came the infamous part. In 797, a group of palace guards, loyal to Irene, allegedly carried out a plot to ensure Constantine would never reclaim the throne. The Suis method: mutilation, specifically an act that would make him unfit to rule under Byzantine law. Some historians say Irene gave the order directly. Others say she merely looked the other way. Either way, the result was the same. Her son was removed from power, and she became the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own name, not as regent, not as consort, but as Basileus the Emperor. Yes, emperor, not empress. Irene used the masculine title because the feminine didn't carry the same weight. She ruled for 5 years, negotiating with foreign powers, stabilizing internal factions, and commissioning new works of art and architecture. But power in Byzantium was never permanent, and hers was always balanced on a knife's edge. In 802, she was overthrown in a bloodless coup led by her own finance minister. The reason? Not cruelty, not corruption, but financial mismanagement, and more insidiously because her gender remained a liability. Irene died in exile, alone, on the island of Lesbos. Not exactly poetic justice, more like imperial footnote. But her legend lived on, refracted through centuries of religious politics and historical misogyny. Was she a saint who saved the icons, a tyrant who betrayed her son, or a cunning political survivor in a world that never forgave women for ruling well? The truth is likely all of the above. Irene didn't sleep her way to power. She outmaneuvered it. She wielded motherhood as both shield and sword until neither could protect her. And perhaps most disturbingly, she didn't seem haunted by it. But if you think that's a messy family drama, wait until you meet a queen whose love life wasn't just whispered about, it was detailed in her own memoirs. Affairs, intrigue, betrayals, all recorded in scandalous prose and poetic revenge. And unlike Irene, she didn't lose her crown. She just made sure her lovers lost everything else. 6. Marguerite de Valois, Queen of France and Navarre. If history had a patron saint of messy royal entanglements, Marguerite de Valois would be the front runner, though she'd probably arrive fashionably late, scandalously dressed and unapologetically laughing. Born into the blood-soaked court of 16th century France, Marguerite was a Valois, and that meant two things: royal blood and political chaos. She was the daughter of Catherine de Medici, one of the most feared political puppeteers in European history, and the sister to three kings of France. From the moment she could read, Marguerite was surrounded by poison, daggers, and the most dangerous weapon of all, marriage alliances. And Marguerite, to her credit, turned all of it into literature. Let's begin at the wedding. Marguerite de Valois married Henry of Navarre in 1572. He would later become Henry IV of France, but at the time he was a Protestant prince marrying a Catholic princess in one of the most volatile religious climates Europe had ever seen. The wedding was supposed to be a peace treaty, a symbol of unity between Protestants and Catholics. Instead, it became a countdown to massacre. 6 days after the ceremony, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre erupted. Thousands of Protestants were slaughtered in Paris, and Marguerite, she was caught in the middle, literally sheltering Protestant allies in her own bedchamber while her family orchestrated killings outside her door. She later wrote that she had to throw herself between attackers and her husband to save his life. This is not your average honeymoon story, but Marguerite's real legend began after the blood dried. Her marriage to Henry of Navarre was, by all accounts, a political arrangement with all the warmth of a hostage negotiation. He had mistresses, she had lovers. They lived mostly apart, but what made Marguerite scandalous wasn't the fact that she had extramarital affairs. It was that she had them openly, strategically, and, most blasphemously of all, without shame. She conducted relationships with nobles, courtiers, poets, and soldiers. Her lovers often found themselves rewarded with titles, land, or banishment, depending on the mood of the court. Her bedroom became a revolving door for rumors and a battlefield for reputations. She wasn't discreet. She was deliberate, and that's what made her dangerous. In a world where queens were supposed to be vessels of virtue, Marguerite became a vessel of agency. Her sexual independence wasn't merely personal, it was political. Every affair was an alliance, every flirtation a power play, and that made her a threat to both her husband and her mother. Eventually, her enemies caught up to her. By the 1580s, Marguerite had become too independent for comfort. Her political alliances were erratic, her love life too public, and her marriage essentially dead. She was arrested, exiled, and imprisoned in the fortress of Usen. Most royal women would have faded into obscurity at this point. Marguerite wrote a memoir. Published decades later, Memoirs of Marguerite de Valois is part confession, part revenge, and all spectacle. In it, she names names, relives affairs, recounts betrayals, and describes life at the French court with the clarity of someone who survived a haunted house and decided to turn it into a stage play. She portrays herself not as a victim, but as a witness. Not as a scandal, but as a strategist who outlived nearly everyone who tried to destroy her. And she did. She outlived her mother, her brothers, her political enemies, and even her estranged husband. Eventually, she was allowed back to court. Her reputation, once in ruins, was retrofitted into something akin to eccentric nobility. She hosted salons, adopted the fashion of the day, and remained a curious mixture of scandal and sympathy until her death. But what makes Marguerite's story compelling isn't just her resilience. It's her refusal to let history define her by its favorite weapon, shame. She had affairs, yes, but she also survived assassination plots, religious purges, political exile, and the chronic misogyny of a court that wanted her silenced. She made mistakes, she made enemies, she made history, and unlike many royal women accused of promiscuity, she got the last word, literally, in print, in her own voice. Which brings us, fittingly, to another queen who also had enemies, lovers, and secrets, though hers were written not in memoirs, but in murder plots and mysterious alliances. She ruled a stormy Scotland and left behind a trail of broken promises, political corpses, and the most suspicious royal marriage in British history. 7. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, didn't just marry badly, she made an Olympic sport of it. Her life was a swirling epic of betrayals, political misfires, and romantic disasters so dramatic they make Shakespeare look like a subtle documentarian. She was crowned as an infant, widowed as a teenager, imprisoned as a queen, and executed as a traitor. And through it all, her love life became both the axis and the accelerant of her undoing. It wasn't just who she slept with, it was who she trusted and who she let too close, too soon, with too much power in their hands. Born in 1542, Mary became Queen of Scotland when she was just 6 days old. 6 days! The crown was practically still warm from her father's head. And from the beginning, her life was more political object than personal journey. She was shipped to France for safekeeping, betrothed to the heir of the French throne, and raised to become the most polished Catholic princess Europe had to offer. She married the future King Francis II, became Queen of France for a blink, and then, just as suddenly, became a widow at 18. France let her go. Scotland called her home. And Mary returned not as a girl, but as a glittering figure of mystery, foreign-educated, fluent in French politics and Italian fashion, and Catholic in a land that was veering uncomfortably Protestant. She was elegant, witty, and by many accounts, charming to the point of distraction. But charm doesn't cancel out suspicion, and Scotland, battered by years of noble infighting and Reformation chaos, was not looking for a queen with flair. It was looking for a reason to rebel. Mary gave them several. Her first mistake, she married Lord Darnley. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was tall, attractive, and exactly the wrong kind of ambitious. At first, it looked like a solid match. Both were Catholic, both had Tudor blood, and together they could strengthen their claim to the English throne. But almost immediately, the marriage disintegrated into chaos. Darnley was arrogant, insecure, and wanted to be king in more than just name. He resented Mary's power. She, in turn, resented his incompetence. Then came David Rizzio. Rizzio was Mary's private secretary and closest confidant. A musician by trade, he rose quickly through her court and was rarely far from her side. This closeness sparked rumors, whispers that they were lovers, that he was manipulating her, that he had too much influence. Darnley, seething with jealousy and needing a political scapegoat, orchestrated one of the most infamous acts in Scottish court history. During a dinner party, Rizzio was dragged out in front of the pregnant queen and stabbed repeatedly by a group of nobles, allegedly with Darnley watching. Mary survived. Her baby, future King James VI, survived. Rizzio did not, and yet somehow Darnley wasn't punished. Instead, Mary tried to reconcile. Historians still debate whether this was a political tactic or a personal mistake. But, regardless of her motives, it didn't save Darnley. Less than a year later, he was dead, blown up in a mysterious explosion at a house outside Edinburgh. His body was found in the garden, apparently unharmed by the blast, but strangled. Subtle it was not. The prime suspect? James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, and here's where the story hits a narrative cliff. Just weeks after Darnley's suspicious death, Mary married Bothwell, the man suspected of murdering her husband. The scandal was immediate and deafening. Some said she was in love. Others claimed she was coerced. Some believed she was complicit. Others thought she was simply outmaneuvered. The only certainty was that the marriage destroyed her reputation. Scotland turned against her. Nobles rebelled, armies rose. Mary was imprisoned, forced to abdicate, and replaced by her infant son. Bothwell fled the country and eventually died in a Danish prison, reportedly mad. Mary fled to England, hoping for protection from her cousin Elizabeth I. Instead, she got 19 years of captivity and a trial that ended in execution. But here's the thing. Mary's legend only grew in exile. She was beautiful, tragic, Catholic, a queen who loved unwisely but too well. And most dangerously, she was a rival claimant to the English throne. Her letters, some authentic, some possibly forged, painted her as a woman torn between love and power, loyalty and survival. Her enemies painted her as a schemer, a seductress, a murderer. Her supporters called her a martyr. She died at Fotheringhay Castle in 1587, formally accused of plotting to assassinate Elizabeth. The trial was more performance than process. The sentence was predetermined, and her last act was as carefully orchestrated as her downfall, dignified, defiant, dressed in scarlet, the colour of martyrdom. Mary, Queen of Scots, remains one of the most polarising figures in royal history. Was she a romantic fool, a political failure, or a woman simply born into a world that gave her power but no control over how she used it? Either way, her story became a kind of warning, especially for queens who dared to love in public. But the next woman didn't wait for history to define her. She rewrote it herself. She came from the gutter, climbed to the throne, and wore every insult like an embroidered badge of honour. Her enemies called her a courtesan. The empire called her empress. And her rise remains one of the most improbable and scandalous power moves in ancient history. 8. Empress Theodora, Byzantium. History has a way of polishing women into archetypes. They become saints, sinners, seductresses, or symbols, rarely individuals. But every so often, someone slips through the mold entirely. Empress Theodora of Byzantium was one of those people. She didn't ascend the throne by birthright, or by accident, or by marrying into a scandal. She got there because she refused not to, and the stories of how she did it, real, exaggerated, or entirely invented, are some of the most politically charged gossip in ancient history. Theodora's early life is hard to pin down, mostly because the man who documented it hated her guts. That man was Procopius, official historian and part-time character assassin. In his secret history, he describes her as a woman of infinite wiles, whose beauty ensnared men and whose ambition terrified them. He accused her of every scandalous behavior imaginable, often with suspiciously theatrical detail. He wrote of her past not with curiosity, but with contempt, which is why modern historians take every word he wrote with a grain of salt, and sometimes a whole salt mine. What we do know: Theodora was born in the 6th century, likely to a lower-class family. Her father worked in the hippodrome, the Byzantine equivalent of a football arena/political battleground. After he died, her family lost its status, and Theodora, still young, found herself in the world of performance and entertainment. That's where the rumors begin. Some say she was an actress, others say she was a dancer, still others whisper she was something more controversial. In Byzantium, the line between performer and scandal magnate was razor thin, but the details matter less than the trajectory, because regardless of how she started, Theodora eventually caught the eye of Justinian, a rising star in the imperial court, heir to the throne, and depending on who you ask, either smitten with her wit or blindsided by her beauty, possibly both. Here's the catch: Byzantine law forbade senators from marrying actresses. That was a problem, so Justinian did what any love-struck future emperor might do. He changed the law. It's one thing to fall in love with a commoner. It's another to rewrite the legal code to make the marriage legal. That's not infatuation, that's infrastructure. They married, and when Justinian became emperor in 527, Theodora became empress, not just in title, but in function. She didn't stand behind him, smiling mutely at ceremonies. She stood beside him in council. She advised, negotiated, and occasionally overruled. Foreign dignitaries wrote of her intelligence. Domestic enemies whispered about her influence. Procopius, who served in the court, spoke of her as if she were a sorceress hiding behind a veil of silk. Her enemies couldn't make sense of her, so they tried to explain her power the only way they knew how, through scandal. She had to be seductive, manipulative, morally suspect. Why else would a former entertainer wield such political weight? She had to have slept her way to the top. It was the only explanation that fit within the boundaries of their imagination. But Theodora wasn't interested in their boundaries. She pushed for women's rights, passed laws to protect lower-class women from exploitation, and expanded the rights of actresses, courtesans, and divorcees. She increased penalties for abuse. She intervened in legal cases. She stood firm during the Nika riots, a citywide revolt that nearly ended Justinian's reign, refusing to flee even when survival seemed uncertain. While Justinian hesitated, Theodora famously declared that royal purple makes a fine shroud. That is not a woman afraid of scandal. That is a woman unafraid of death if it meant dying with authority. Still, the rumors stuck. Even centuries later, people can't quite agree on how to remember her. To the Orthodox Church, she became a saint. To Procopius, she remained a vulgar climber. To modern historians, she's a case study in how a woman in power becomes a canvas for projections. Did she really rise through scandal, or did scandal rise to meet her once she had power? It's hard to say, but what's clear is that Theodora did not play by the rules of her time, and for that, her memory has been alternately celebrated and maligned ever since. She dared to live out loud in a world that preferred its women either silent or sanctified. She was neither, and she paid for that with a legacy that's still being debated 15 centuries later. But if Theodora weaponized her past to rewrite her future, the next queen on our list did something even stranger. She allegedly turned the entire royal court into a honey trap of flirtation, espionage, and intrigue. Some say she sent lovers as spies. Others say she merely understood that lust was often more persuasive than loyalty. Either way, she never held the throne herself, but she held every man who sat on it in the palm of her gloved hand. 9. Catherine de' Medici, Queen Consort, Regent of France. Catherine de' Medici didn't need a crown to rule France. She wore patience like armor, ambition like perfume, and used motherhood as her most strategic weapon. And while other queens were condemned for a handful of lovers, Catherine was accused of orchestrating an entire court of them. Weaponized seduction turned statecraft. Whether it's true or not is beside the point, because in the French court, the truth was often less powerful than a well-placed rumor, and Catherine knew how to plant them like roses, with thorns carefully tucked just out of sight. Born into the formidable Medici banking dynasty of Florence in 1519, Catherine was never supposed to be France's puppet master. She was orphaned young, imprisoned during political upheaval, and later married off to Henry, Duke of Orleans, who would eventually become Henry II of France. The marriage, politically useful, was personally barren. For 10 years she failed to produce an heir, and in a royal court, infertility wasn't a private matter. It was national emergency disguised as gossip. To make matters worse, Henry had a mistress, Diane de Poitiers, not just a mistress, the mistress. Elegant, intelligent, and 20 years his senior. Catherine, meanwhile, was young, foreign, and considered culturally suspect. The Medici name, once powerful, carried the faint odor of Italian banking and papal politics, too Catholic for some, too mercantile for others. In short, she was tolerated, not embraced. But Catherine wasn't interested in court popularity. She was interested in survival and eventually in control. Once she began bearing children, 10 in total, though only 7 survived infancy, her position solidified. Then, in 1559, Henry II died suddenly in a jousting accident. His eldest son, Francis II, took the throne, and Catherine stepped quietly into the role of Queen Mother, then Regent, then something far more dangerous, the power behind the power, and that's where the stories begin. Catherine ruled during one of the most tumultuous periods in French history. The wars of religion were tearing the country apart, Protestant Huguenots and Catholic loyalists at each other's throats. Her sons, Francis II, Charles IX, and finally Henry III, each wore the crown like it was made of broken glass. And Catherine, in the background, pulled strings, negotiated alliances, and tried desperately to keep France from collapsing into permanent civil war. But no one likes a woman who holds the leash, even when the dog is rabid. So her enemies gave her a nickname, the Black Queen. They painted her as a poisoner, a sorceress, a schemer whose fingerprints were on every assassination and every betrayal. Her Italian background helped fuel the fire. She was accused of introducing sinister foreign influences into the French court: alchemy, astrology, and most notoriously, sex as espionage. Which brings us to the Flying Squadron. According to legend, and perhaps a few creative ambassadors, Catherine created a corps of female courtiers trained in the arts of seduction. Their mission? To infiltrate rival political factions, extract secrets, and manipulate powerful men through pillow talk and charm. These women, known as l'escadron volant, were said to float through court like perfume and poison, gathering intelligence, influencing decisions, and reporting back to Catherine. The evidence for their existence is at best circumstantial. Historians remain divided. Some see it as classic misogynistic paranoia, others as plausible strategy in a court where marriages were just slow-motion treaties. Either way, the myth stuck, and Catherine, who never publicly acknowledged such a scheme, did nothing to dispel it. She knew power often came not from controlling the narrative, but from letting others fear what they didn't understand. Her real genius, however, was not in the rumored spycraft. It was in balancing factions, manipulating alliances, and outlasting everyone who tried to sideline her. She arranged the controversial marriage of her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, to the Protestant Henry of Navarre in a failed attempt to unite France, a move that immediately preceded the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, one of the bloodiest events in French history. Did Catherine orchestrate it, prevent it, simply fail to stop it? Depends who you ask. But her name has been inked into the story either way. In the end, Catherine died not as a villain, nor as a saint, but as a woman who tried to keep a doomed dynasty breathing while everyone around her was busy setting the house on fire. She wasn't loved, she wasn't trusted, but she was effective. And in a century where most queens were either figureheads or sacrificial pawns, that alone made her threatening. Her legend, like her court, remains full of half-truths and shadows. Was she the mastermind of a central spy network, or merely the scapegoat of a collapsing regime, her every move painted in darker tones because she dared to play the game better than most men? Either way, her reputation set a precedent that a woman who moved pieces behind the curtain was just as dangerous as the one who danced in front of it. And speaking of queens whose personal lives became political theatre, the next monarch didn't dabble in flirtation. She allegedly wielded obsession like a private scepter, and some say kept secrets in her drawing room that still spark arguments to this day. Because when a prim and proper queen starts surrounding herself with mysterious companions and unspoken arrangements, the question becomes, what's love and what's leverage? 10. Queen Victoria, Britain. For a queen so famously draped in black, Queen Victoria lived a life that was anything but colourless. She ruled for over 6 decades, lending her name to an entire era, Victorian, a word now synonymous with moral rigidity, social repression, and laced-up propriety. Yet behind the stern portraits and the endless mourning veils was a woman whose private life fascinated, scandalized, and confused her contemporaries. If history remembers her as the Empress of Restraint, it's only because it forgot to check the footnotes. Victoria came to the throne in 1837, just 18 years old, and fresh out of a childhood marked by stifling control. Her mother and the infamous Sir John Conroy had micromanaged her existence under the so-called Kensington system, a joyless regimen that kept her isolated, monitored, and conveniently pliable. But the moment she became queen, Victoria did something rather unpliable. She banished Conroy and began to rule on her own terms. It was the first move in what would become a pattern of resisting control, even as she came to symbolize it. Then came Prince Albert, her cousin, her partner, her ideological opposite. Victoria proposed to him, a reversal of gender roles that set the tone for their complicated dynamic. Albert was everything Victoria was expected not to be: earnest, reform-minded, dispassionately intellectual. She, by contrast, was emotional, stubborn, and wildly expressive in her affections. Their marriage was passionate, at least according to Victoria's diaries, where she wrote with startling candor about her love for him. In public, they were the perfect picture of domestic monarchy. In private, Victoria was often the more emotionally intense of the two. They had 9 children, 9, and while the Victorian myth later canonized them as the ultimate moral couple, there were whispers even then, rumors of Victoria's obsessive devotion, of jealous outbursts, of a love so fierce it bordered on possessive. She relied on him not just emotionally, but politically. When Albert died suddenly in 1861, Victoria collapsed into a mourning so elaborate it became national policy. She wore black for the rest of her life, another 40 years. But here's where the story starts to twist. In the decades following Albert's death, Victoria didn't retreat into monastic silence. Instead, she began to surround herself with companions, intimate ones. And it's here that the image of the prudish widow queen starts to fall apart. First, there was John Brown, a Scottish servant, blunt, fiercely loyal, and by all accounts utterly uninterested in court etiquette. Victoria adored him. She relied on him. She elevated his position. She allowed him to speak to her in ways no other man dared. She gave him nicknames. She signed letters to him as "Your loving Victoria." The court was scandalized. Rumors flew. Some claimed they were secretly married. Satirical newspapers referred to her as Mrs. Brown. Paintings were defaced. Ministers protested. Victoria ignored all of it. Brown died in 1883. She mourned him deeply. And then, almost immediately, another figure appeared, this time from a world even farther removed from the drawing rooms of Windsor. His name was Abdul Karim, a young Indian servant presented to her during the Golden Jubilee. Within months, he became the Munshi, her teacher in Urdu, her cultural guide, her personal confidant. She wrote of him constantly. She gave him land, titles, privileges. She dined with him alone. She defended him against racism from her own children and advisors, and again the rumors exploded. This wasn't just a friendship, they said. This was something more, an inappropriate closeness, a possible manipulation, a scandal with imperial implications. But here's the catch. We don't actually know. Victoria's personal diaries and letters regarding Karim were heavily edited, some destroyed after her death, especially by her son Edward VII, who wanted to scrub the Munshi episode from the royal record. What survives suggests a relationship of deep affection, complex interdependence, and emotional intensity. Whether it crossed romantic lines is, as ever, open to interpretation. And maybe that's the point. Victoria's life, like her empire, was defined by contradictions. She ruled an age of sexual repression, but left behind documents full of longing and intimacy. She was a moral icon who defied political advisors for the sake of controversial companionships. She was a woman known for mourning, who surrounded herself with fiercely loyal male figures that the court never quite knew how to categorize. So, was Queen Victoria a passionate woman trapped in the machinery of propriety, or a master manipulator of image, constructing a public mourning mask to conceal a private life lived on her own terms? The answer depends on which letters you believe and which ones were burned. But what's clear is that the deeper you dig into her personal life, the less Victorian Queen Victoria appears. Behind the black dresses and porcelain portraits was someone far more human, conflicted, possessive, emotionally intense, and possibly quietly rebellious. And if Victoria's scandal lay in emotional intimacy hidden beneath propriety, the next queen wore her independence like a silk sari on the front page of Vogue. She didn't just flirt with power, she photographed it, drove it, shot tigers next to it, and smiled while doing it. To her admirers, she was elegance incarnate. To her critics, she was royalty gone rogue, and while the world watched in fascination, she lived the kind of life most queens were never allowed to even imagine. 11. Queen Gayatri Devi, India. If Queen Victoria cloaked her private life in the language of duty, Queen Gayatri Devi wrapped hers in silk, confidence, and a very fast jaguar. She wasn't born to scandal, but she certainly entertained it. Born in 1919 to a Bengali princess and a Maharaja of Cooch Behar, Gayatri Devi was royal from the cradle, and she wore it like a challenge, not a privilege. She was raised in Indian palaces and European boarding schools, fluent in French, English, Hindi, and the subtler art of being too sophisticated to care what anyone thought of her. While other royals perfected the art of looking regal, she learned how to ride, hunt, shoot, and say no. When she wanted something, she didn't wait for permission. She simply walked toward it, usually with the press watching. Which brings us to the scandal. If we're measuring by ancient European standards, where queens are only allowed scandal in the form of poetry or exile, Gayatri Devi was not scandalous. She was merely modern. In pre-independence India, however, that was more than enough. At the age of 12, she met the man who would later become her husband, Sawai Man Singh II, the Maharaja of Jaipur. Tall, handsome, and already married, to 2 other wives as custom allowed, he was the closest thing India had to a princely movie star. He was athletic, cosmopolitan, and charming in that slightly untrustworthy way that powerful men often are. Gayatri Devi was smitten, but she was also calculating. This was not a fairy tale, it was a negotiation. Their courtship stretched for years. She wouldn't agree to marry him until he promised certain conditions: her own space, her own freedom, and a role in public life. He agreed. She became the 3rd wife, but in most ways, the first in everything that mattered: public image, political influence, and the magnetic glamour that would make her one of the most photographed women in the world. Unlike most royal consorts, Gayatri Devi didn't disappear behind palace walls. She burst onto the public stage like a slow-motion explosion, appearing in Vogue, driving her own cars, wearing chiffon saris with pearls, hunting with a rifle, and giving interviews that made heads tilt and eyebrows lift. The British press adored her, so did the international fashion elite, and so did a confused post-colonial India still trying to decide whether it wanted its royalty quiet, reclusive, or abolished entirely. But Gayatri Devi didn't care about categories. She simply lived as if the boxes didn't exist. After independence, when princely states were merged into the Indian Republic, she reinvented herself yet again, this time as a politician. In 1962, she ran for parliament. Her party, the Swatantra Party, a right-leaning opposition to Nehru's Socialist Congress. Her platform? Freedom, economic liberalism, and the suggestion that perhaps the elite weren't always the problem. Her opposition, the entire political establishment. She won anyway, in a landslide. In fact, she won with what was then the world's largest electoral majority, according to the Guinness Book of Records. And yet, even in Parliament, the whispers followed. Not of corruption, not of incompetence, but of style. She was too glamorous, they said. Too privileged, too fluent in English, too fond of cocktails, polo matches, and European friends. It was the same old story. When a woman moves through power with elegance, critics reach for character assassination through aesthetics. And the real irony, Gayatri Devi's personal life was far less dramatic than people wanted it to be. There were no confirmed affairs, no broken marriages, no secret lovers smuggled through side doors. She was devoted to her husband, and after his death in 1970, she remained single. But the image of her, the beautiful royal widow, elegantly aloof, was irresistible to gossip mongers. She was linked to everyone from foreign diplomats to movie stars, though none of it stuck because none of it was substantiated. Still, her grace became its own kind of defiance. In a country wrestling with what to do with its royal past, Gayatri Devi didn't apologize for hers. She modernized it. She ran schools. She championed women's education. She advocated for heritage preservation. And when Indira Gandhi declared the emergency in 1975, suspending civil liberties and imprisoning political opponents, Gayatri Devi was arrested and thrown in jail. Even behind bars, she maintained her reputation. She didn't beg, she didn't break, she wore khadi instead of chiffon, ate prison food without complaint, and emerged 161 days later with her dignity and fan base intact. So was she scandalous? Not in the usual sense. She didn't have lovers falling at her feet or plots swirling around her name. But her independence was scandal enough. Her refusal to be quiet, to be conventional, to be anything but dazzling, that was the real threat. She redefined what royalty could look like in a democratic world. Not ornamental, not obsolete, but active, intelligent, and impeccably dressed. And yet, even a queen like Gayatri Devi, educated, powerful, beloved, could not escape the slow erosion of royal influence in a modernizing nation. The world moved on, monarchies became memoirs, and so did she. But the next queen on our list never needed velvet or vintage cars to draw attention. She lived in an ancient land, ruled in ritual silence, and fought not for style points, but for survival. And her story begins not with a scandal, but with bones buried beneath an oracle's words, in a palace older than history, where power was measured in bronze and bloodlines, and queens ruled beside kings in the shadows of ancestral spirits. 12. Fu Hao, China Shang Dynasty. In the dusty silence of ancient Anyang, where oracle bones cracked over flames and ancestors whispered through tortoise shells, there lived a queen who broke every rule before history had time to write them. Her name was Fu Hao, and she didn't simply exist in a world dominated by men. She conquered it, literally. But to call Fu Hao merely a queen is to undersell her. She was a general, high priestess, royal consort, landowner, military commander, and spiritual gatekeeper, all rolled into one enigmatic figure. And though she lived over 3,000 years ago, during the Shang dynasty, China's second historical dynasty, her story reads less like a footnote and more like a myth hiding in plain sight, which is ironic because for centuries no one even remembered she existed. Her name re-emerged not through song or scrolls, but through science. In 1976, archaeologists uncovered her undisturbed tomb in Anyang, Henan province. Inside were the remains of a woman surrounded by riches, jade artifacts, bronze weapons, ceremonial vessels, and a staggering number of oracle bones. But it wasn't just what she left behind. It was what those bones said. The inscriptions revealed something that turned centuries of patriarchal assumptions on their heads. Fu Hao had not just been a wife, she had led armies, massive ones, into battle. She had performed key rituals for the Shang king. She had owned land in her own right. She had received sacrifices after her death typically reserved for rulers and deities. In other words, she was not just exceptional, she was foundational. And yet, like so many powerful women in history, her reputation became entangled with speculation, especially about her role as a royal consort in a polygynous court. Fu Hao was one of King Wu Ding's many wives, possibly one of over 60, but she was not background decoration. While other consorts played traditional roles, Fu Hao was entrusted with matters of state and war. Wu Ding routinely turned to her to lead campaigns against hostile tribes, the Tufang, the Qiang, the Yi, and the Ba. Oracle bone inscriptions document these expeditions with stunning clarity. Not only did she fight, she won again and again. And here's where the intrigue sets in. In a royal household with dozens of wives, why did one woman rise to such prominence? Why her? And how did the other consorts, who were themselves likely part of noble lineages, respond to her ascent? Records remain silent, but the possibilities are tantalizing. Was she resented by her peers? Was her military prowess a threat to the palace's internal politics? Was her access to ritual power, the ability to speak to the ancestors, a source of tension? Or was she protected by the king's favour and her battlefield success? The historical vacuum invites the usual swirl of assumptions. Some historians speculate that her prominence might have caused jealousy or disruption in the palace. Others suggest that her unique skill set, equal parts military and mystical, made her indispensable. After all, in Shang society, spiritual authority and statecraft were inseparable. Being able to conduct divinations wasn't just religious, it was political. If you could interpret the ancestors' will, you could influence everything from war declarations to agricultural planning. And Fu Hao didn't just participate in rituals, she led them. That alone places her at a crossroads of gender, power and politics rarely seen in ancient royal records. Her role blurs the line between queen and priestess, between servant of the divine and master of the material world. It also raises the tantalizing possibility that the Shang court, for all its patriarchal leanings, may have been more flexible, more opportunistic about who could wield power than previously thought. Still, it's impossible to ignore the faint outlines of contradiction. A woman elevated in a male-dominated system, praised for her loyalty, yet given unprecedented autonomy, treated as both subordinate and sovereign. The historical record doesn't call it a scandal, but only because the scandalous nature of her power was too deeply embedded in ritual to be openly questioned. Fu Hao died young, possibly in her early 30s, but even in death, she retained authority. Her tomb was given royal treatment, filled with ritual vessels and animal sacrifices. The bronze weapons buried beside her weren't symbolic, they were hers. The jade artifacts weren't decorative, they were ceremonial tools. The respect she commanded was not borrowed from her husband. It was earned in blood, belief, and battlefield legend. So no, Fu Hao doesn't make this list because of romantic liaisons or bedroom intrigues. She makes it because her life and afterlife existed at the precarious intersection of royal privilege, spiritual mystique, and gendered power. A queen among warriors, a general among priests, a wife among kings. And if that sounds like a contradiction, it's because history often is. But the next queen on our list didn't need a tomb full of bronze to earn her reputation. She lived much later, but her legacy is no less tangled in whispers and power plays. She was scandalous not for what she did, but for who she may have done it with. Her royal title was questioned, her fidelity was doubted, and her children, let's just say the family resemblance has been up for debate ever since. 13. Maria Louisa of Spain, Queen Maria Louisa of Parma. If you ever want to understand how power eats its own, just look at Maria Louisa of Parma. She was Queen of Spain for nearly 4 decades, and in that time she ruled nothing officially, but was blamed for everything. And when history ran out of reasons to accuse her of political incompetence, it circled back to an old favourite: sex, alleged affairs, illegitimate children, scandalous influence over a handsome favourite. It's all there, embroidered in gossip, stitched into caricature, and preserved in the footnotes of scandal sheets disguised as royal chronicles. She was born in 1751, the daughter of the Duke of Parma and Princess Louise Elizabeth of France, which made her Bourbon royalty on both sides. In other words, destined for dynastic duty. At 13, she was married off to Charles IV of Spain. then just Prince of Asturias, and a man who would go on to redefine the phrase boring monarch. Charles was not a monster. He was not a tyrant. He was instead the exact kind of mediocrity that history can't be bothered to hate. He loved hunting, clocks, and religion. He had the emotional depth of a porcelain figurine and the political insight of a mildly confused taxidermist, which meant that from the very beginning, Maria Louisa's marriage was less a partnership and more a very polite form of imprisonment. But Maria Louisa, she was vivid, she was sharp, and she was tired of pretending her husband was interesting. That's where Manuel de Godoy comes in. Godoy was a young noble from Extremadura, handsome, ambitious, and quick with a smile. He entered the royal court as a guard, and, within a few years, had ascended to become one of the most powerful men in Spain. Why? That depends on who you ask. The official story says Charles favoured him for his loyalty and political usefulness. The unofficial story says Maria Louisa favoured him for reasons whispered in every salon from Madrid to Vienna. She was 25 years older than him. She promoted him rapidly. She defended him obsessively, and people noticed. Godoy became the lightning rod for all of Spain's political frustrations, and Maria Louisa became the alleged storm cloud behind him. Whenever something went wrong, it was attributed not to incompetence or corruption, but to their supposed relationship. Napoleon mocked her. Caricatures portrayed her as a seductress manipulating a love-struck courtier. Pamphlets referred to her as Godoy's puppet master, or worse, his mistress. Some even claimed that several of her children were actually his, not the king's. Let's pause there. There is zero solid historical evidence that any of these rumors are true, but in the eyes of the public, truth was irrelevant. Maria Louisa was powerful. She was politically active. She had opinions and didn't always keep them to herself. That was more than enough to warrant moral condemnation. And the politics were only making things worse. Under Charles IV, Spain tumbled from one foreign policy disaster to another. Alliances with revolutionary France, wars with Britain, internal economic collapse, everything fell apart with embarrassing speed. Godoy, as Prime Minister, was seen as responsible, and Maria Louisa, as his alleged protector and benefactor, was painted as the architect of Spain's decline. By the time Napoleon's armies invaded in 1808, the Spanish people had had enough. An uprising forced Charles IV to abdicate in favour of his son, Ferdinand VII. Maria Louisa was exiled, along with her husband and her beloved Godoy. They ended up in Rome, where the former queen, once draped in silks and surrounded by ministers, was reduced to living under surveillance, her reputation in tatters. She died in 1819, far from the court she had once animated, remembered less as a monarch and more as a cautionary tale. And yet, beneath the layers of rumour, a more interesting truth flickers. She was one of the few royal women of her time who dared to act as if power belonged to her. Not symbolically, not as regent, but actively, as a political agent with real preferences, real influence, and real loyalty. To her family, to her allies, and perhaps, yes, to a man who history still insists was more than just a friend. So, was Maria Louisa guilty of anything beyond bad taste in politics? Probably not, but she committed the ultimate royal sin. She refused to play the background, and for a queen in 18th century Europe, that was always going to be unforgivable. But if Maria Louisa's alleged scandal lay in her proximity to power, the next queen didn't hover behind the throne. She was the throne. She weaponized her love affairs with brutal precision, seduced entire empires, and still managed to make her name synonymous with allure and political manipulation. She didn't just survive the game, she redefined it. 14. Cleopatra II, Egypt. If myth had a marketing department, Cleopatra would have been its star client. Over 2 millennia of history, legend, poetry, and propaganda have turned Cleopatra VII into a Rorschach test for every cultural anxiety about women, power, and seduction. She has been remembered as a serpent, a sorceress, a sex symbol, a suicide icon, a manipulator, and a martyr. Rarely has she simply been remembered as what she was, the last active ruler of Ptolemaic Egypt, a shrewd political operator, and a woman who used every tool at her disposal: intellect, charisma, alliances, and yes, romantic entanglements, to delay the collapse of an ancient empire. Let's start by burning one of the more persistent myths to the ground. Cleopatra was not Egyptian. She was Greek, descended from Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals who carved out a Hellenistic kingdom in Egypt after Alexander's death. For 3 centuries, the Ptolemies ruled as a foreign elite, rarely bothering to speak the native language or assimilate to the culture they governed. Cleopatra broke that mold. She spoke Egyptian, unlike her royal predecessors, and multiple other languages besides. She presented herself not just as a foreign queen ruling Egypt, but as Egypt itself. She came to the throne at 18, co-ruling with her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIII. As royal traditions went, this meant marrying him. As practical power struggles went, this meant war. Cleopatra was ousted in a palace coup. She fled to Syria, and from there she launched one of the most legendary political comebacks in history, armed not with legions, but with presence. Enter Julius Caesar. The story of Cleopatra meeting Caesar is often told in theatrical shorthand: the rug, the reveal, the seduction. But the real twist wasn't the romance, it was the negotiation. Cleopatra didn't just charm Caesar, she aligned herself with the most powerful man in Rome at the moment, when her throne depended on outside backing. Caesar, ever the opportunist, saw in her a partner and a symbol. Together, they defeated her brother's forces. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile. Cleopatra was reinstalled as queen, this time co-ruling with a different, more pliable brother. And then, as was customary in her dynasty, she married that brother too. Cleopatra and Caesar's relationship, romantic, political, or both, produced a child, Caesarion. She visited Rome, lived in one of Caesar's estates, and shocked the Romans by existing too flamboyantly, too foreign, and far too female for their liking. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, she fled back to Egypt with her son, and an even more complicated political landscape in tow. Then came Mark Antony. Antony, like Caesar, didn't meet Cleopatra as a wide-eyed lover. He met her as a fellow strategist. She needed protection for her kingdom. He needed the wealth and grain Egypt could provide for his campaigns. Their partnership, sealed in style at Cleopatra's palace in Tarsus, evolved into something more personal and much more dangerous. Together, they had 3 children. Together they ruled eastern territories with imperial flair, and together they provoked the wrath of Rome. Octavian, later Augustus, began a propaganda war painting Cleopatra as the foreign temptress who had bewitched a Roman general into betraying his nation. Antony, under her spell, had supposedly given away Roman provinces to their children. Cleopatra was no longer a queen. She was cast as an existential threat to Roman values. This was not just slander, it was strategy. Rome could not justify war against Antony alone, he was too popular, but against a foreign queen, a woman who allegedly lured him into decadence and disloyalty, that was easier to sell. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE was the climax. Octavian's forces defeated Antony and Cleopatra's fleet. The couple fled to Egypt. There, with power slipping through their fingers, they tried diplomacy, distraction, anything to forestall the inevitable. It didn't work. The end came quickly. Antony died. Cleopatra followed. The manner of their deaths has been so romanticized, it's hard to tell fact from fabrication. But what matters is this: with her death, Egypt fell, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended, and Rome became an empire. Cleopatra became legend. But why has her legacy remained so intertwined with scandal and seduction? Perhaps because it's easier to reduce a powerful woman to her lovers than to grapple with her actual power. Cleopatra ruled for over 2 decades. She stabilized a fragile kingdom, managed complex international diplomacy, and fought, literally and politically, to keep Egypt independent. That her greatest crimes are still described in terms of who she slept with rather than what she built says more about her chroniclers than her character. She was not the victim of her lovers. She was their equal, and in some cases their better. But if Cleopatra turned her liaisons into empires, the next queen on our list was demonized for what she allegedly allowed in hers. She wasn't just scandalous, she became a metaphor for idolatry, for indulgence, for danger disguised as devotion. And whether she was real, embellished, or rewritten by righteous fury, her name has echoed for thousands of years as a warning no one fully understands. 15. Queen Jezebel, Israel, Phoenicia. Say the name Jezebel today, and you won't conjure the image of a queen, or even a person, really. You'll conjure a symbol, a cautionary tale, a slur. Over centuries, her name has morphed into a shorthand for feminine treachery, sexual manipulation, and spiritual corruption. A woman whose sins were so vivid she was thrown from a window, eaten by dogs, and fossilized in scripture as the gold standard of depravity. That's quite the resume for someone whose actual historical footprint is still debated. Let's try to find the real Jezebel buried beneath centuries of outrage. She lived in the 9th century BCE, during a time when the Kingdom of Israel was still a relatively young political experiment. Jezebel was a Phoenician princess from Sidon, daughter of King Ethbaal, himself a high priest of Astarte, a goddess of fertility, sexuality, and war. Her marriage to Ahab, king of Israel, was a diplomatic masterstroke. The union brought trade, maritime influence, and foreign prestige, but it also brought friction, religious friction. Ahab was king of a Yahweh-worshipping kingdom. Jezebel was a priestess and patron of Baal and Asherah, Canaanite deities associated with storms, fertility, and nature. Her arrival in Israel wasn't just a royal exchange of vows, it was the arrival of an entirely different worldview, carried into the palace on gilded sandals. And this is where the trouble begins. Jezebel didn't merely tolerate her gods, she promoted them, aggressively. She sponsored Baal's prophets, built altars, supported pagan rites, and, according to the biblical narrative, persecuted the prophets of Yahweh. Most famously, she clashed with Elijah, the fire and brimstone prophet who called down divine fury like it was his personal calling card. The story goes that after Elijah humiliated Baal's prophets in a theologically charged showdown, Jezebel ordered him hunted. He fled into the wilderness. She remained in the palace. The portrait we get from the Book of Kings is not subtle. Jezebel is framed as a spiritual usurper, a foreign queen meddling in sacred affairs, a woman who not only corrupted her husband, but defiled the nation. She is accused of sorcery, deceit, arrogance, vanity, and murder. She is shown manipulating court politics, especially in the notorious case of Naboth's vineyard, where a man is executed on trumped-up charges so Ahab can seize his land. According to the narrative, Jezebel orchestrated the plot. But here's the thing, none of the above necessarily confirms Jezebel's character. It confirms how deeply the authors of these stories disapproved of her. In reality, Jezebel was a queen consort functioning in a patriarchal theocracy where any form of foreign influence, especially female and religious, was perceived as a threat. She was not the first queen to bring foreign gods into Israel, but she was the most vilified. Possibly because she wasn't just symbolic of idolatry, she was active, outspoken, politically effective. In other words, she didn't stay in her lane, and that, more than her supposed promiscuity or blasphemy, might have been her true crime. The Bible never outright accuses her of adultery, though later interpretations eagerly supplied that part. Her sexuality became shorthand for heresy. Her makeup, mentioned in her final scene, became evidence of vanity. Her power became proof of wickedness, and her downfall, dramatic and brutal, became prophecy fulfilled. She was thrown from a palace window, trampled by horses, and her body left to be eaten by dogs. It's theatrical, symbolic, and purposefully dehumanizing. Jezebel's death was not just execution, it was erasure, a narrative purification. Her body was denied royal burial, and her name was turned into a curse. But centuries later, we're left asking, was Jezebel truly the villain, or was she a victim of religious spin? Was she an oppressive tyrant, or simply a queen who didn't convert quietly? Was she a political player, or a woman whose foreignness made her unforgivable? Some scholars argue that Jezebel represents the fear of the outsider woman, the powerful, articulate foreign figure who upsets the established order. Others see her as a kind of historical scapegoat, her actual influence exaggerated to serve a theological purpose. After all, it's easier to condemn a kingdom's collapse when you can blame it on a woman in eyeliner. In any case, her legacy has outlived her body by millennia. Jezebel has become a label applied to anyone, especially women, who challenge orthodoxy too directly, speak too boldly, or simply fail to know their place. But if Jezebel was turned into a symbol of corruption by her enemies, the next empress on our list was branded with similar fire, accused not just of heresy, but of weaponizing her sexuality to rule over a vast and ancient empire. And while much of her story is tangled in propaganda, one thing is clear: she didn't wait for permission to govern. She took the throne, and once she had it, she never gave it back. 16. Empress Wu Zetian, China. In the 7th century, China did something it had never done before and would never officially do again. It crowned a woman as emperor, not empress, not regent, not the polite ceremonial placeholder that history usually offers to women in monarchies. But Huangdi, Emperor of China, son of heaven, undisputed ruler of one of the most complex and bureaucratically disciplined civilizations in the world. Her name was Wu Zetian, and if history has remembered her as ruthless, scandalous, and sexually manipulative, it's not because she was unique in those qualities, it's because she succeeded while being a woman. Wu Zetian didn't begin in power. She began in a Buddhist family in Wenshui County, born into the lower ranks of nobility. At 14, she entered the imperial court as a concubine to Emperor Taizong, one of the most powerful men of the Tang dynasty. She didn't stand out much at first. She was one of many concubines in a court that functioned like a maze of ritualized invisibility. After Taizong's death, she was expected to enter a Buddhist convent, as was custom for former imperial consorts with no children. But Wu Zetian did not disappear. She returned. And this is where her story begins to make historians sweat. She somehow re-entered court life, not through formal invitation, but through Emperor Gaozong, Taizong's son, who had once known her as a girl in his father's harem. The nature of their renewed relationship is still debated. Was it romance, political alliance, a carefully calculated seduction? Regardless of how it began, Wu Zetian became Gaozong's favored consort and eventually his empress. That transition was not smooth. Gaozong already had an empress, and court factions did not welcome this ambitious, lower-born woman with open arms. But Wu Zetian knew the architecture of court power. She maneuvered through it with patience, policy, and yes, some ruthlessness. Enemies disappeared. Rivals were demoted or disgraced. Accusations flew, often dark and theatrical: murder, poisoning, manipulations of imperial heirs. Some of it may be true, some of it may be fictionalized by later Confucian historians who had every incentive to portray her as a moral catastrophe. The truth, predictably, sits somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. After Gaozong suffered a stroke, Wu Zetian effectively ran the empire. She sat in on council meetings, issued edicts, and governed in his name. And after his death, she didn't step aside as regents were expected to. She simply stayed put, first ruling through her sons, then in 690 CE declaring herself emperor. It wasn't just unprecedented, it was scandalous in its very concept. A woman sitting on the dragon throne. It defied centuries of patriarchal political theory. Confucian scholars were horrified. The moral order had been inverted. The cosmos itself, according to some interpretations, should have rebelled. But here's the twist. The people did not. Wu Zetian was, in many ways, an effective ruler. She promoted meritocracy, reduced the power of aristocratic clans, expanded the civil service exams, and supported infrastructure projects. She elevated the status of women in subtle but lasting ways. She used Buddhism to counterbalance Confucian resistance, sponsoring temples and aligning herself with divine prophecy. In fact, one of the more creative myths spread during her reign was that she was a reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha, come to usher in a new era. And still, the stories of her sexual exploits flourished. They said she took young lovers by the dozen, that she kept a secret harem of virile men hidden in the palace, that her political decisions were driven by lust, not strategy. These stories were repeated not just during her life, but for centuries after, particularly by male historians who found it easier to explain her power through scandal than governance. Even her name became slippery. Official histories referred to her coldly. Later folktales either demonized or eroticized her, and modern historians have spent decades trying to disentangle her actual policies from the tabloid energy of ancient texts. Was Wu Zetian ruthless? Absolutely, but so were her male predecessors and successors. Was she cunning? Unquestionably. So was every survivor of court politics. Was she morally compromised? Probably. But then again, what ruler wasn't? The true scandal of Wu Zetian wasn't that she ruled like a man, it's that she ruled better than many of them and didn't apologize for it. Her reign ended in old age, not in flames. She abdicated, under pressure, and died peacefully in her 70s. Her tomb remains one of the grandest in China, flanked by a stone stele that is famously blank. No inscription, no eulogy, just silence. Historians have debated why. Some say it was left blank intentionally to let future generations judge her for themselves, or perhaps she knew they would anyway. And if Wu Zetian's power was scandalous because of what she claimed for herself, the next queen faced scandal of a different kind, one whispered across deserts and river valleys, passed through myth and oral tradition, remembered not for what she ruled, but for how she loved, or at least how legend says she did. Because when royalty crosses into legend, every glance becomes seduction, and every story becomes a warning or an invitation. 17. Queen Candace, Candace of Meroe. Long before Cleopatra played chess with empires on the banks of the Nile, there was another line of queens ruling further upstream, fierce, shadowy figures wielding power over a kingdom that both defied and mystified the ancient world. Their title was Candace, translated loosely as Queen, more accurately as Queen Mother, and functionally as Supreme Ruler. These were the sovereigns of the Kingdom of Kush in present-day Sudan, and among them one name echoes with particular weight, Candace, or rather a Candace, because Candace wasn't a given name, it was a dynastic title held by a succession of ruling women. The Greeks and Romans, never ones to let cultural nuance get in the way of a good anecdote, turned Candace into a singular, semi-mythic figure. A queen so formidable that Alexander the Great allegedly thought twice about invading her lands. A queen whose military might and political cunning shocked even the war-hardened generals of Rome. A queen whose legend became a tangle of fact, fiction, and whispered scandal. Let's try to unravel it. One of the most famous references comes from Strabo, the Greek geographer who wrote of a Candace who led the Kushite resistance against the Romans around 25 BCE. According to him, she was one-eyed, iron-willed, and utterly unimpressed by Roman swagger. After Rome annexed Egypt, the Kushites, under this Candace's command, launched attacks into southern Egypt, sacking cities, toppling statues of Augustus, and sending a clear message. The empire may have devoured Cleopatra, but it would not digest Kush so easily. The Romans struck back. Candace negotiated. And here's the remarkable part. She won. A peace treaty was signed. The Kushites retained their independence. Tribute was waived, and Rome walked away quietly without its usual arrogance. For an empire that prided itself on turning foreign royalty into footnotes, this was a notable exception. And yet, for all her military triumphs, Candace's legacy has also been wrapped in more intimate speculation. In Greco-Roman and later Arabic sources, Kushite queens were often portrayed as dangerously powerful and suspiciously unconventional. Stories circulated about their supposed sexual freedom, their command over both male and female consorts, their royal courts where marriage, inheritance, and power didn't follow the expected patriarchal lines. Some accounts described Candace, or her successors, as having multiple lovers, selected and dismissed at will, a royal prerogative that scandalized foreign writers more than any battlefield victory. Was this true? Possibly. Was it exaggerated? Absolutely. The Kushite royal structure was deeply matrilineal, with lineage often traced through the queen mother rather than the king. Women held power not just symbolically, but administratively, militarily, and ritually. In other words, they ruled without needing to borrow authority from their husbands or sons, and that, to the Greek and Roman chroniclers who couldn't imagine a legitimate female sovereign without seduction as a weapon, was deeply unsettling. So they explained it the only way they knew how, through scandal. They turned political autonomy into sexual transgression. They saw queens who selected their own consorts and assumed it meant orgiastic palaces. They interpreted matrilineal succession as proof of excessive femininity, ignoring the fact that these women led armies, negotiated treaties, and governed vast territories with more competence than many of their male contemporaries. And yet the image stuck. Even centuries later, European explorers and colonial writers spoke of the Kandaks with a mix of awe and suspicion. In oral traditions passed through Nubian and Ethiopian cultures, the stories became more mythic, featuring Candace-like queens who challenged Solomon, who rode lions into battle, who ruled lands of gold and granite. These legends blurred the line between history and allegory, but they retained a core truth. In Kush, queens were not accessories to kings. They were the kings. There are no scandalous diaries, no salacious letters, no palace intrigue recorded in detail for the Candaces. What we have instead are battle reports, stone inscriptions, and outsider accounts that reflect as much about the observer as the observed. To the Romans, a woman in armor was unnatural. To the Kushites, it was Tuesday. So did Candace really have multiple lovers? Perhaps. But that wasn't the scandal. The scandal was that she didn't need permission. She didn't need a king's blessing to rule, or a male regent to speak on her behalf. She ruled from a throne carved into desert stone under the scorching sun, with elephants at her command and no apologies in her mouth. And if the idea of a sovereign woman choosing her own lovers shocked the empires around her, so be it. But if Candace was feared for ruling like a man, the next queen was mythologized for something stranger, arriving at court not with an army, but with riddles, not with declarations, but with questions. She came bearing gold, incense, and unsettling wisdom, and left behind a mystery that has never been solved, only reinterpreted again and again. Because when a queen becomes a question, the answers always reveal more about the world than the woman herself. 18. Queen of Sheba. No one knows exactly where she came from, only that when she arrived, it was impossible to ignore her. The Queen of Sheba doesn't belong to just one culture, religion, or continent. She drifts through Jewish scripture, Islamic tradition, Ethiopian legend, and Arabian folklore like a shadow stitched in gold. Sometimes she's a monarch, sometimes a sorceress, sometimes a moral parable, but always a mystery. What we do know, or at least what the stories tell us, is that sometime around the 10th century BCE, a woman ruling a wealthy kingdom in the south heard rumors of a man, a king, a wise one. His name was Solomon, and his reputation had stretched across deserts and seas like wildfire. Curious and maybe skeptical, she packed up her caravan and set out for Jerusalem, not to kneel, but to test. She came not with swords, but with riddles. That alone made her scandalous. According to the Hebrew Bible, 1 Kings 10, the Queen of Sheba arrived with a very great train, camels carrying spices, gold and precious stones, and posed difficult questions to Solomon, questions meant to probe the limits of his famed wisdom, and he answered them, all of them. The scriptures are careful to underline this. He was not just wise but unflappable, but they are also careful not to say too much else. What happened next? The Bible is vague. She praises his God. She gives him gifts. He gives her gifts in return. She leaves. The end. Except, of course, it wasn't. Because into that silence, legends flooded in. The Jewish Midrash claimed she was seduced by Solomon, or that she tried to seduce him and failed, or that she bore his child, or that she was a demoness with hairy legs. Take your pick. In Islamic tradition, she becomes Bilqis, a queen whose throne is magically transported to Solomon's court. The Quran doesn't name her, but the story there adds even more spiritual weight. She converts to monotheism, impressed not just by Solomon's power, but his command of nature, animals, and the elements. Then there's the Ethiopian version, more dramatic, more nationalistic, and significantly more personal. In the Kebra Nagast, a 14th century Ethiopian chronicle that draws on earlier oral traditions, the Queen of Sheba is not just a visitor to Solomon's court, she is the mother of his heir. Their union produces Menelik I, who returns to Ethiopia with the Ark of the Covenant. This version doesn't flirt with suggestion, it makes it explicit. Solomon and the Queen of Sheba sleep together, and the result is a dynastic line that legitimizes the Solomonic emperors of Ethiopia for centuries. In this telling, the Queen of Sheba becomes Makeda, not merely a visitor to wisdom, but a vessel of it. So what's the scandal? Well, that depends on where you stand. In some traditions, the scandal is sexual, an unmarried queen and a foreign king, sharing a bed and producing a child with international implications. In others, the scandal is political, a woman daring to test, challenge, and ultimately convert under her own terms. In still others, the scandal is theological, because her story blurs the line between divine providence and very human temptation. But perhaps the deeper scandal is that we still don't know who she was. Where was Sheba? Was it Saba in Yemen, or Aksum in Ethiopia, or a kingdom straddling both across the Red Sea? Was she a real monarch or a composite figure assembled from centuries of storytelling and trade? Archaeologists have found inscriptions, ruins, temple complexes, all hinting at powerful female leadership in the ancient kingdoms of South Arabia and the Horn of Africa, but nothing conclusive. The Queen of Sheba hovers just beyond certainty, precisely where legends thrive. Even her iconography is unstable. To some, she's black, to others, Arab. Sometimes she wears gold bangles and perfumes the air with frankincense. Sometimes she appears in Christian altarpieces, cloaked in European robes, kneeling before Solomon like a penitent. Sometimes she arrives on a camel, sometimes on a wind-blown throne. always beautiful, always clever, always unsettling. Because here's the thing, her power is not martial but intellectual. She doesn't conquer with armies, she conquers with curiosity. She doesn't challenge Solomon with force, she challenges him with questions. And in every version of the story, even when she is awed by him, she is never diminished. She comes, she sees, she questions, she departs, and she leaves something behind. An heir, a legend, or a moral tremor that still hasn't settled. Was she seduced, or did she seduce? Was she a pagan queen converted by divine light, or a sovereign who saw through political theatre and played along anyway? Was she a victim of Solomon's wisdom, or the reason we still care about it? The Queen of Sheba may have been one woman, or many, or none, but in every version she bends the rules of what a queen is allowed to be: bold, searching, autonomous. And if her scandal lies in that freedom, the next queen on our list makes no apologies for it. She ruled not with riddles, but with spears. She faced down empires, carved her legacy in stone and scar tissue, and left behind stories that suggest power. Real power never asks for permission and never begs to be remembered. 19. Queen Amanirenas, Kush, Nubia. Some rulers inscribed their victories in scrolls. Others commissioned paintings, poems, or imperial rescripts. Queen Amanirenas, she left behind a decapitated Roman statue buried in the sands of Sudan. Its smug marble head dragged halfway across a kingdom and buried beneath the steps of a temple like a trophy. She didn't just fight an empire, she humiliated one. And yet, outside of archaeological circles and a few dusty footnotes in Roman annals, her name barely registers in popular history. Maybe that's because she ruled an African kingdom Rome couldn't colonize. Or maybe it's because she led armies with the kind of ferocity that refuses to be footnoted. Either way, Amanirenas ruled the kingdom of Kush in the 1st century BCE, a region south of Egypt in what is now Sudan, rich in gold, iron, incense, and military stamina. She held the title of Kandake, like Candace before her, a queen regent or queen mother, and in her case, the commander-in-chief of Kushite resistance against Augustus Caesar, Rome's first emperor, and a man unaccustomed to being told no. The scandal with Amanirenas wasn't in her private life, it was in her defiance. Because if Roman historians were baffled by anything, it was this: how could a woman, visibly blind in one eye, from battle no less, dressed in war armor and mounted on horseback, lead a coordinated military assault against Rome's prized new province of Egypt, and get away with it? Let's rewind. After Cleopatra's death and Egypt's annexation, Rome felt confident. The southern border seemed secured. Augustus, always eager for propaganda victories, installed Roman officials in newly acquired cities and expected the region's neighbors to behave accordingly. Amanirenas did not. According to the Strabo and other Roman sources, who, to be fair, were never known for objectivity when describing women in power, the Queen of Kush launched an unprovoked attack on Roman settlements in 25 BCE. In reality, the Romans had been pressing southward, enforcing taxes and reshaping local economies to fit their imperial blueprint. It wasn't so much unprovoked as unwelcome. And Amanirenas, reading the situation quite clearly, struck first. Her forces invaded southern Egypt, sacked several towns including Aswan, burned Roman statues, and carried off loot, including famously a bronze bust of Augustus. The statue's head was taken back to Meroe, the Kushite capital, and buried beneath the steps of a victory temple, so that everyone entering the sanctuary would symbolically walk over the Roman emperor's face. Not subtle, extremely effective. Rome retaliated, as Rome does, but here's where things diverge from the usual imperial script. After initial counterattacks, a truce was negotiated. Rome didn't annex Kush, it didn't force tribute, it didn't even demand the statue back. The Kushites retained their autonomy, and Amanirenas, she retired. From battle, not in chains, but in triumph. This peace was more than symbolic. It carved out a rare precedent in Rome's global story, a powerful female ruler of a black African kingdom successfully resisting imperial expansion. The Romans, experts in rewriting failures as victories, quietly omitted the finer details, but the result was undeniable. Amanirenas had done what Cleopatra could not, preserved her kingdom's independence from Roman domination, and yet, despite her military legacy, whispers persisted, more so in later retellings than in contemporary records. Oral traditions and colonial-era speculation tried to fill in the blanks. Was she married? Did she rule alone? Did she use lovers as spies, as other queens allegedly had? Was she ruthless at court? Did she take multiple husbands? No concrete evidence survives to confirm any of this, but that didn't stop the rumors from forming, because history often refuses to believe that a woman can wield power without seduction as her secret weapon. The truth, what little survives, suggests something more radical. Amanirenas didn't use romance as a political tool because she didn't need to. Her authority came not from bedroom alliances or palace intrigues, but from battlefield command, religious legitimacy, and her status as mother to the heir. That alone made her threatening enough, and the Romans were very threatened. Strabo, ever the reliable vessel of imperial ego, described her as a masculine sort of woman, a term Roman writers often applied when they couldn't comprehend a woman refusing to be ornamental. It wasn't a compliment, it was an admission of confusion. But for Amanirenas, ruling like a man wasn't the scandal, it was the rebuttal to one. She fought Rome on her own terms. She didn't flatter them, fear them, or fake diplomacy for the sake of survival. She brought war to their doorstep, and when they blinked, she walked away with her kingdom intact. No temples dedicated to her lovers, no poems lamenting lost youth, just an empire forced to back down, and a buried statue head that still whispers through the sandstorms of Sudan. And if that sounds like the end of the story, think again. Because the next queen didn't just challenge colonial power, she flipped it, subverted it, and then rewrote herself as both warrior and diplomat. She used alliance as a survival tool, politics as performance, and legend as armor. And whether her lovers were real or invented, they were never more powerful than the story she made of herself. 20. Queen Nzinga, Nzinga Mbande of Ndongo and Matamba. If power had a voice, Queen Nzinga's would have sounded like silk stretched over steel, smooth, calculated, unbreakable. She was the kind of ruler colonial empires feared, not because she wielded brute force, but because she understood the game better than they did, and she played it without flinching. For over 4 decades in the 17th century, Nzinga ruled the kingdoms of Ndongo and Matamba in Central Africa, modern-day Angola, facing down the Portuguese with a mixture of battlefield defiance, diplomatic mastery, and, if you believe the sources, the kind of personal life that would make most European courtiers blush. Which, of course, brings us to the Whispers. To understand the scandalous mythology of Queen Nzinga, you have to start with the world she inherited. Ndongo was under siege. The Portuguese were advancing inland from Luanda, trafficking slaves and exploiting internal divisions. The ruling dynasty was buckling under pressure, and when Nzinga's brother became king, she stepped into the role of envoy, sent to negotiate with the colonial enemy at a time when African women were supposed to sit politely behind the scenes. She did not sit politely. In her first recorded act of political theatre, Nzinga met with the Portuguese governor in Luanda and found no chair offered to her, only a floor mat, a symbolic gesture of inferiority. So she ordered one of her attendants to kneel, sat on his back, and negotiated eye to eye. That wasn't just diplomacy. That was a declaration, and it worked. She secured a peace treaty. She even agreed to be baptized, taking the name Ana de Souza Nzinga. in a strategic move that softened Portuguese resistance and gave her temporary leverage. But when the treaty broke down, and when her brother died under suspicious circumstances, Nzinga did what so many kings had done before her. She took the throne. This, of course, was a problem. Not for the people of Ndongo, many of whom supported her, but for the Portuguese and their European allies, who couldn't stomach the idea of a woman, particularly a non-Christian one, exercising unchecked power. So they did what people tend to do when they can't defeat a woman outright. They rewrote her into something unnatural, and so began the stories. Some said she dressed as a man in battle, that she took male concubines and dressed them as women, that she maintained a harem of young men whom she forced into deadly contests for her attention, that she murdered lovers after a single night. Others claimed she surrounded herself with enslaved boys whom she mutilated to ensure their loyalty. Some of these tales were penned by Jesuit missionaries. Others came from Portuguese colonial reports. None are supported by local oral histories. What's more likely is that Nzinga carefully cultivated her image, leaning into and subverting European expectations of gender, power and morality to make herself untouchable. Did dress in masculine clothes, but not as a costume, rather as a calculated political performance. She declared herself king rather than queen, not out of confusion, but to solidify her legitimacy in a patriarchal structure that would otherwise dismiss her. And if she took lovers, she did so on her terms, never as a weakness, always as a privilege of power, which, for European observers trained to see female sexuality as sin or submission, was incomprehensible. But the real scandal wasn't in her private life, it was in her success. For nearly 40 years, Nzinga resisted colonial domination. She led armies. She formed alliances with rival African powers. She relocated her capital into more defensible terrain. When necessary, she converted to Catholicism. When not, she rejected it openly. She understood that to survive as a sovereign African monarch in the age of European expansion required not just force, but flexibility. And somehow she kept winning. Even in her 60s, she led troops into battle. Even in her 70s, she negotiated with colonial governors like an equal. And when she died at the age of 81, she left behind a stabilized kingdom, a power structure that outlasted the Portuguese advance, and a reputation that could not be easily rewritten, no matter how much propaganda tried. Was she brutal? At times. But so was everyone else. Was she strategic? Always. Did she use personal relationships to consolidate power? Possibly. But unlike many of her European contemporaries, Nzinga never apologized for it. She never asked for permission to rule. She simply ruled. And centuries later, the contradictions in her legacy remain. Saint and sinner, warrior and queen, feminist icon, and ruthless monarch. But perhaps the only label that truly fits is this: survivor. And speaking of survival, the next queen wasn't just fighting empires, she was fighting extinction. Her people were on the verge of being wiped from the record, and still she stood at the edge of history like a final defiance. Her name was invoked in both fear and reverence, and though her reign is cloaked in myth, what little survives suggests that sometimes the most scandalous thing a woman can do is refuse to disappear. 21. Queen Deia, Kahina of the Berbers. They called her Kahina, the sorceress, not because she cast spells or brewed potions, at least not in any literal sense, but because she dared to predict the future, and worse still, she was right. In the late 7th century, as Arab-Muslim armies pushed westward across North Africa, leaving shattered kingdoms and redrawn borders in their wake, they ran into something they hadn't expected. A woman, a queen, a general, a prophet, a Berber warrior named Deia, who stood not just in their path but in their imagination, as both a threat and a mystery. She ruled the Oros Mountains, a rugged, defiant stretch of land in modern-day Algeria, home to fiercely independent Berber tribes who had little interest in joining anyone's empire, whether Roman, Byzantine, or Arab. Deia united them, not through inheritance or divine right, but through sheer necessity. The land was under siege, and the only thing standing between the encroaching caliphate and complete conquest was a woman with a sword in one hand and a prophecy in the other. That alone was scandal enough. Most of what we know about Deia comes from early Islamic chroniclers, who described her as powerful, charismatic, and terrifying. They were baffled, even shaken, by her ability to command. She led armies, she commanded loyalty. She rallied tribes that couldn't agree on anything except that they would not be ruled. Her name, Deia, is Berber, but the title Kahina stuck, meaning seer, priestess, or witch, depending on how generous the chronicler felt that day. It's worth noting that the Arabic term Kahina was rarely used as a compliment. When a woman led resistance and refused to convert, sorcery was the easiest accusation to make. Easier than admitting she outmaneuvered a military campaign. Easier than explaining how a woman, non-Arab, non-Muslim, and entirely self-made, became the last wall between a caliphate and the western end of the continent. Deia fought with ruthless precision. After initial Arab advances swept through much of North Africa, she struck back hard. She is said to have routed invading forces, pushing them eastward and reclaiming territory in a counter-offensive that stunned both sides. For a brief moment, she didn't just resist, she won, but her tactics earned her enemies. One of the most controversial decisions attributed to Deia was the scorched earth strategy she supposedly employed against her own land, burning fields, destroying infrastructure, even razing towns to deny resources to the invaders. Was this a military strategy, a myth exaggerated by her enemies, or propaganda used to recast a revolutionary into a villain? Historians are divided. To her supporters, she was a freedom fighter defending her people by any means necessary. To her enemies, she was a destructive force, a madwoman who tore down her own kingdom rather than let it be ruled. And then there's the matter of her personal life, what little we can even confirm. Some accounts say she was Jewish, others claim she was Christian, and still others suggest she followed traditional Berber spirituality. The ambiguity was convenient for those looking to paint her as an exotic heretic. She was said to have had 2 sons who were either captured or defected to the Arab side, depending on the version you read. Some versions of her story claim she took an Arab captive as a lover or husband, either to convert him or to manipulate him. Again, the sources diverge, and again, none of it is confirmed. But the rumors persist, not because they're reliable, but because Deia's very existence violated so many expectations. A woman commanding armies? Scandalous. A woman refusing conversion? Threatening. A woman uniting tribes? Unbelievable. A woman doing all 3 while winning battles against the most powerful empire of her age? That demanded an explanation. And if it couldn't be logical, it would be moral. If it couldn't be moral, it would be magical. Call her a witch. Call her a traitor. Just don't admit that she was a queen who nearly stopped history. Eventually, she was defeated. The Arab general Hassan ibn al-Nu'man regrouped, reinforced, and returned. Deia's forces were overwhelmed. She is said to have died in battle around 702 CE. Some legends say she died fighting to the last. Others say she cursed her enemies with her final breath. Still others claim she vanished into the mountains, leaving behind only echoes. Today, she remains a symbol, claimed by different movements for different causes. Feminists call her a proto-revolutionary. Nationalists see her as a mother of Berber resistance. Secularists remember her as the last voice of pre-Islamic North Africa. And always in the background, the same 2 questions persist. Who was she really? And why do they keep trying to bury her story in footnotes? Because Deia's scandal wasn't in whom she loved or what religion she followed. It was that she loved her land more than she feared an empire, that she believed autonomy was worth any cost, and that she ruled like someone who didn't need to be remembered, only obeyed. The next queen on our list ruled a very different empire in a far more gilded cage. Her enemies didn't ride in on horses. They watched from behind gold-plated walls, whispering behind fans, and her scandals weren't waged on the battlefield. They unfolded in hushed corridors, among silk robes, chamber musicians, and the heavy scent of palace intrigue. 22. Queen Suthida and the royal consorts of Thailand. In the golden palaces of modern Thailand, where power wears a smile and scandal wears a sash, queens are not just royal figures. They are mythological symbols, curated in gold leaf and polite silences. To be queen here is to become an icon of dignity, obedience, and elegant restraint, which is precisely what makes the real stories lurking behind ceremonial robes and carefully arranged photo ops so deeply compelling. Queen Suthida, the current queen consort of Thailand, is a living embodiment of this strange contradiction. She is both a modern woman and a deeply traditional symbol, a military general and a ceremonial figurehead, a commoner who became queen in one of the world's most opaque and tightly managed monarchies. And somewhere between the silken curtains of spectacle and power, her life has become entangled with a monarchy that seems to generate rumors faster than it issues royal decrees. Let's start at the surface. Suthida Tijai was born in 1978 to a middle-class Thai-Chinese family. She worked as a flight attendant for Thai Airways, an elegant, respectable profession, but not one traditionally associated with royal ascension. In most monarchies, marrying into the palace from outside aristocracy is rare. In Thailand, it's nearly impossible. Yet in 2014, Suthida quietly entered the royal orbit, not as a public figure, but as a bodyguard. Yes, a bodyguard. Specifically, she became the deputy commander of Crown Prince Vajiralongkorn's Royal Guard. Promotions followed. Medals appeared. Her rise through the ranks was rapid, so rapid that observers quickly realized this was no ordinary military appointment. In 2016, she was named a full general. In 2019, just days before the coronation of Vajiralongkorn as King Rama X, Suthida was formally declared queen consort in a surprise royal wedding ceremony. The nation was informed only hours in advance. The announcement was carefully choreographed. Photos were released of the couple kneeling together before sacred relics dressed in traditional finery. It was an image of seamless tradition, but to those watching closely, it raised more questions than it answered. Because Suthida's rise didn't happen in a vacuum. For years, King Vajiralongkorn's personal life has been the subject of fascination, rumor, and carefully hushed scandal. Even before his accession, he had a reputation for extravagance, unpredictability, and a deeply complex romantic life. He has had multiple wives, multiple divorces, and multiple partners, some of whom received royal titles only to have them revoked in sweeping public purges. One such case involved Sininat Wongvajirapakdi, a former army nurse who was appointed Chao Kun Phra, royal noble consort, just months after Suthida's coronation. This made headlines not just in Thailand, but globally. For the first time in nearly a century, a Thai king had publicly named an official consort alongside his queen. The images released were surreal. Sininat in full military uniform sitting barefoot at the king's feet, smiling like a magazine cover from another century. Then came the reversals. Sininat was abruptly stripped of all titles in 2019, accused of disloyalty and ambition. The royal statement claimed she had tried to elevate herself to the same status as the queen, that she had acted against the monarchy, that her behavior was inappropriate. She disappeared from public view. 10 months later, she reappeared. Her titles were restored. Her record was erased, officially declared never to have been tarnished. No explanation was offered, none was needed. In the Thai royal court, narrative control is absolute, and Queen Suthida, she remained silent throughout. Her public appearances have been limited, deliberate, and always serene. She bows, smiles, greets dignitaries. Her military titles remain intact, but her role, for all its ceremonial grandeur, exists in a palace where the walls whisper louder than the people. Some speculate that her position is more symbolic than relational. Others believe she maintains quiet influence. No one knows for sure, and that perhaps is the point. In Thailand, criticism of the monarchy is not just discouraged, it's criminal. The lèse-majesté laws are among the harshest in the world. Even a social media post, a joke, or an academic paper can result in imprisonment, which means the monarchy exists in a kind of performative vacuum, constantly seen, rarely questioned, always controlled. And within that vacuum, Queen Suthida is both icon and cipher. To some, she represents a dutiful queen, loyal and graceful, enduring a complex royal life with composure. To others, she is a figure of quiet tragedy, another woman caught in a monarchy that treats romance as protocol and affection as performance. Either way, she is far from alone. Thai history is filled with royal consorts, concubines, and wives whose stories were erased or rewritten depending on the mood of the monarch. In earlier centuries, Thai kings maintained harems filled with hundreds of women, some politically placed, others chosen for beauty, talent, or simply convenience. Power within these inner courts shifted constantly. Love, if it existed, had to be negotiated between etiquette, hierarchy, and invisibility. Which brings us to the larger truth. In Thai royal culture, romantic scandal is rarely acknowledged directly. It's encoded, sanitized, or silenced. But that doesn't mean it isn't real. And the next queen on our list ruled a world where silence wasn't an option. She ruled an ancient kingdom from the mountains, surrounded by warriors, threatened by foreign fleets, and guided by prophecy. She may have been brutal, she may have been brilliant, but above all else, she refused to be tamed. Her name has nearly vanished from history, but her legend still rises with the smoke from war-torn hills and lost cities. 23. Queen Teuta, Illyria. In the 3rd century BCE, a queen ruled the jagged coastline of the Western Balkans, a place where the mountains fell straight into the sea, and empires learned, usually too late, that not all queens wear gold to be worshipped. Some wear armor to be avoided. Her name was Teuta, and she was queen of the Ardii, one of the most powerful Illyrian tribes. But she wasn't born into a throne. She stepped into it abruptly, violently, and without apology after the death of her husband, King Agron. What followed was one of the earliest and most fascinating political clashes between a ruling queen and an emerging superpower, Rome. And if the stories surrounding her reign seem laced with contradiction and controversy, that's because they are. Teuta didn't fit the template, so history did what it always does when women complicate the narrative. It rewrote her as a scandal. To the Romans, Queen Teuta wasn't just an enemy, she was an outrage. But let's begin where history does, at her husband's funeral. King Agron had led the Ardii to military success, defeating rival Greek forces and expanding Illyrian influence along the Adriatic Sea. But when he died suddenly around 231 BCE, Teuta became regent for her young stepson. She was now ruler of a confederation of tribes known more for piracy than for diplomacy, wedged between Greece to the south and Rome across the water. Most regents would have tried to play it safe, stabilize, retreat, flatter. Teuta did the opposite. Under her rule, Illyrian naval raids expanded. Pirate ships flew under her flag, sacking merchant vessels from Greece to Italy. She encouraged aggressive maritime activity as a matter of policy, not just because it enriched her kingdom, but because it allowed her to project power in a world where female rulers were expected to be ornamental or temporary. This didn't sit well with Rome. By 230 BCE, Roman merchants had lost patience, and more critically, profits. When envoys were sent to Teuta's court demanding the end of Illyrian piracy, she allegedly dismissed them with spectacular arrogance. According to Roman sources, particularly the Greek historian Polybius, who wasn't exactly subtle with his editorializing, Teuta told the envoys that Illyrian subjects were free to pursue their own interests, and that it wasn't her job to restrict private enterprise at sea. It was a spectacular line. Too spectacular, perhaps, because shortly afterward, one of the Roman envoys was murdered, either during his return voyage or while still in Illyria. Rome, predictably, took this as an act of war. Whether Teuta ordered the killing or it happened without her consent remains unknown. But the result was the same. Rome declared war on Illyria. And here's where the propaganda machine kicks into high gear. The Romans, who hadn't yet developed their taste for emperors and dynasties, were still young enough to be offended by the idea of a woman leading an army. Teuta wasn't portrayed as a military commander. She was framed as a reckless widow, an unstable regent, a woman corrupted by too much power and not enough restraint. Sound familiar? She was accused of acting like a pirate queen, encouraging raids, looting cities, destabilizing trade. The implication, always unspoken but never absent, was that her authority was illegitimate by virtue of gender. Her refusal to submit diplomatically was read as petulance. Her strategic aggression was labelled hysteria, and any semblance of court intrigue, real or invented, was polished into scandal. One version of her story hints at indulgence, suggesting she surrounded herself with sycophants, favoured pleasure over prudence, and ignored wise male counsel. Another paints her as a political tactician who understood that piracy wasn't chaos, but policy, a way to fund the state and push back against maritime colonialism. Neither version admits the obvious. Teuta was behaving exactly as male rulers had done before her, only more effectively. When Roman forces eventually invaded, they defeated her navy and pushed Illyria back to its mountainous strongholds. But they didn't destroy her. Teuta negotiated peace. She surrendered some territory, paid tribute, and agreed to scale back Illyrian piracy. But she kept her throne. That, in Roman terms, was failure. You don't just fight a female enemy, you erase her. Teuta's survival was a kind of victory they couldn't easily narrate. After the treaty, she vanishes from most records. Some say she lived out her days in political exile. Others suggest she quietly rebuilt power behind the scenes. No statues remain, no tomb has been found, but her name persisted, passed down through fragmented texts, half praised, half feared, always distorted. Was she a pirate queen? Possibly. Was she ruthless? Likely, but so were her adversaries. What makes Teuta unique is not that she ruled during war, or that she refused to surrender to empire. It's that she was remembered as the war. Her very presence was treated as provocation. Her rule was framed as rebellion. But even more provocatively, she didn't die for it. She made a deal. And the next queen on our list didn't just make deals, she made myth. Her story is told in epic poems and ancient scrolls, stitched into sacred texts and royal genealogies. She wasn't just remembered, she was deified. But behind the divine symbolism lies a woman whose story has been retold so many times, no one is quite sure where the truth ends and the legend begins. 24. Queen Makeda, Ethiopia's Queen of Sheba in Ethiopian legend. If myth and monarchy had a shared address, it would be somewhere in the highlands of Ethiopia, under the long shadow of the Simeon Mountains. There, in the woven tapestries of legend, stone-carved churches, and whispered oral traditions, lives Queen Makeda, Ethiopia's Queen of Sheba. Her name is not just remembered, it's foundational. national myth, divine heritage, scandal. Well, that depends on who's telling the story. Because unlike her more ambiguous appearances in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic texts, where she's often unnamed or briefly sketched, the Ethiopian version of the Queen of Sheba is grand, specific, and deeply intimate. Her name is Makeda, her destination is Jerusalem, and her legacy is nothing less than the birth of a dynasty that would claim to rule Ethiopia for nearly 3,000 years. Let's begin with the text that sets it all in motion, the Kebra Nagast, or the Glory of Kings. Written in the 14th century, but drawing on centuries of oral tradition, it tells the story of how Makeda, Queen of Ethiopia, travelled to visit King Solomon in search of wisdom, but found something else entirely. Now, depending on your tolerance for allegorical romance and ancient statecraft, the narrative may read like a holy love story or a political origin myth dressed up in divine flirtation. Either way, it goes like this. Makeda, having heard of Solomon's unparalleled wisdom, sets out on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. When she arrives, she is received with royal honours. Their conversations span days. She asks him riddles. He answers them with poetic ease. She is impressed deeply, and so is he. So impressed, in fact, that Solomon decides to make sure she doesn't leave empty-handed. Or alone. Here comes the famous pact. Makeda agrees to stay in Solomon's palace, but makes him swear he will not touch her. Solomon agrees, but adds a clever clause. She must also promise not to take anything from the palace without his permission. That night, Solomon orders a feast, heavy on salt and spice. At midnight, Makeda wakes, parched, and reaches for water. Solomon appears. "You took something," he says, invoking the clause. The implication is clear. The agreement is void. And so, according to legend, she spends the night with him. She departs for Ethiopia soon after, pregnant. Her son, Menelik, is born and raised in Ethiopia, but travels to Jerusalem as a young man to meet his father. Solomon receives him warmly. When Menelik returns, he allegedly takes with him a group of Israelite nobles, and, most controversially, the Ark of the Covenant. Yes, that Ark. According to Ethiopian tradition, it still rests in Aksum, hidden in a guarded chapel that no one, except one appointed monk, is allowed to enter. No proof, no photos, just myth, mystery, and an overwhelming sense of sacred secrecy. Makeda, for her part, returns not in shame or scandal, but as the mother of a new, divinely sanctioned bloodline. The Solomonic dynasty, which traces its roots through Menelik I, would go on to rule Ethiopia, with interruptions for centuries. Even Emperor Haile Selassie, deposed in 1974, claimed his legitimacy through her. But the Kebra Nagast leaves a curious silence around Makeda herself after the birth of Menelik. We hear less of her rule, her later life, or how she was viewed by her own people once she returned. This silence, like most in ancient texts, is filled by speculation. Some say her story was sanitized to protect the dynasty's paternity narrative. Others argue that her reign was eclipsed by her role as a sacred vessel, a woman reduced to a mythic womb delivering divine authority to male successors. Still others believe the myth was retrofitted entirely, designed to merge Christian, Judaic, and local traditions into one legitimizing mythos for Ethiopia's rulers. But let's go back to the scandal, because in any other context, what Makeda did would have been unthinkable. A sovereign queen journeys across the world alone to meet a foreign king. She debates him, dines with him, and sleeps with him. She returns pregnant, unwed, and undeterred. She raises her son without shame. She never denies him his lineage, and she never apologizes. In the Ethiopian version, this is not portrayed as weakness or folly. It's portrayed as destiny. And yet, to some outside observers, particularly in later European Christian traditions, Makeda's story raised uncomfortable questions. Was she seduced? Was she complicit? Was she clever? Was she naive? Was this a love story, a power exchange, a theological parable? The answer, most likely, is yes. Because Makeda was never just a queen, she was a myth in motion, adapted by every generation to reflect its own anxieties about women, power, race, and divinity. She was both the bridge and the border, between nations, between faiths, between scandal and scripture. And while her son became the founder of a royal line, Makeda herself became something even more elusive, a symbol too powerful to pin down. Some say she was descended from angels. Others say she ruled a land of gold and spices. And still others say she never existed at all. But if Makeda was a myth, she was a myth that moved empires. And the next queen wasn't interested in myth. She was far more pragmatic. She ruled a kingdom of wealth and temples, surrounded by stone pyramids and unbothered by Roman maps. Her power wasn't declared in scrolls or dynastic sagas. It was etched into the granite walls of tombs built by women who never asked to be explained. 25. Queen Amani Shaketto Kush Meroe. If you stand in the blistering heat of modern-day Sudan at the ruins of Meroe and squint past the sand-blasted pyramids and sun-worn inscriptions, you can just about sense her presence, Queen Amani Shaketto. Her name is not often found in world history textbooks, but her image is carved in stone, flanked by gods, dripping in gold and utterly unafraid. She was a queen who didn't just rule, she radiated power from head to heel, and yet, like many queens of the ancient kingdom of Kush, she remains paradoxically visible and invisible. Her likeness survives in reliefs, her jewelry rests in museums, her monuments, what's left of them, still stand, but her story? That's the mystery. It's scattered in fragments, half-deciphered inscriptions, Roman accounts that got the names wrong, and local oral traditions that refuse to die. So what do we know? Amani Shaketto ruled sometime around 10 BCE to 1 CE, a period when the kingdom of Kush, centered in Meroe, was at a cultural and economic peak. This wasn't a fading corner of an old empire. This was an African power in its own right, trading iron, gold, ivory, and incense across the Red Sea and up the Nile, resisting both Roman incursion and historical erasure, with the quiet confidence of a civilization that didn't need validation. And Amani Shaketto? She wasn't just part of this kingdom. She was one of its architects. She held the title of Candace, Queen Mother or Queen Regent, a designation that in Kushite tradition didn't suggest second-hand power. It meant ruling authority. Candaces commanded armies, led diplomatic missions, and served as religious figures. They weren't ceremonial ornaments, they were the state. Amani Shaketto ruled during a time of consolidation and construction. Her name appears on temple walls, throne bases, and statues, usually accompanied by an overwhelming array of divine titles. She's often shown in full regalia, crown, scepter, and an expression that could curdle Roman wine. Her pyramid at Meroe, though partially destroyed by 19th century treasure hunters, once stood as one of the grandest in the royal cemetery. And in 1834, when an Italian explorer named Giuseppe Ferlini dynamited its summit because subtlety was not his strong suit, he found an astonishing cache of gold and jewelry, bracelets, signet rings, necklaces, and diadems, all bearing Amani Shaketto's name and likeness. The treasure eventually made its way to museums in Berlin and Munich, where it remains today, disconnected from its original context, but still unmistakably regal. Even in theft, her power lingers. So where's the scandal? Well, that depends on how you define it. For the Greek and Roman world, a queen who ruled in her own name, unattached to a king, militarily independent, spiritually sovereign, was a scandal. Add to that the suggestion that some Kushite queens, including Amani Shaketto, may have had multiple consorts or male attendants who served both ceremonial and personal functions, and you begin to understand why European writers were so quick to exoticize her. They couldn't quite imagine a woman with so much agency who wasn't somehow scandalous. The narrative options were limited. She must be either a virgin goddess, a scheming seductress, or a tragic widow. But Amani Shaketto refused all three scripts. She ruled not as someone's wife or mother, but as a divine being in her own right. The records don't tell us about her romantic life, not directly, but what we do have are hints that she lived in a royal culture where gender dynamics were more fluid than in Rome or Greece. Queens could be warriors, kings could be sidelined, succession could follow the maternal line. The temples she built show her standing side by side with gods, not kneeling before them. That alone rewrote the rules. So when European explorers and scholars tried to reconstruct her image, they defaulted to familiar tropes: the Oriental Queen, the African Cleopatra, the black seductress with gold and secrets. They couldn't see her without projecting onto her. Her gold became evidence of vanity. Her temples became monuments to ambition. Her face, serene and symmetrical, became a mirror for their discomfort. But Kushite history didn't care about their discomfort. Amani Shaketto's rule marked a continuation of a matriarchal tradition stretching back centuries. She was not an anomaly. She was a link in a chain. And though her story has been interrupted by looters, colonizers, and the passage of time, it hasn't been erased. The real scandal, then, isn't what Amani Shaketto did. It's how little we're allowed to know about her. She may have loved, she may have taken consorts, defied expectations, and ruled with calculated charm. Or she may have been a political ascetic, devoted entirely to governance and ritual. We don't know, and that uncertainty makes her dangerous, because when a powerful woman isn't reduced to a single story, she remains unpredictable. And unpredictable queens don't just haunt history, they shape it. Which brings us to the end of this particular list, but not the end of the mysteries. Because every queen we've explored lives in a peculiar shadow, powerful enough to be remembered, but controversial enough to be misremembered. Their scandals, real or fabricated, say more about the people who recorded them than about the women themselves. History doesn't preserve power, it preserves judgment, and when a woman defies both, she becomes something rarer than a ruler. She becomes a myth that refuses to die.